Clara Bennett was still on her knees in the dirt when the auctioneer's gavel came down and the whole yard started laughing. She didn't stand up. She didn't look at the men pointing at her from the rail. She just pressed both hands flat against the neck of a gray mare so thin the bones showed through the skin, and she said low and fierce so only the horse could hear, "You're still breathing. That's enough. That's more than enough. $2 silver, 32 dying horses, and a secret that the most powerful man in Montana Territory had paid everything he owned to keep buried." Before we go any further, if this is the first time you've found this channel, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss a story. And drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from, because I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the summer of 1881, and the day that changed everything. The auction yard at Black River Valley was half empty by the time the auctioneer got to the last lot of the day, and the men still standing around the rail had already made up their minds about what they were looking at before he opened his mouth. The good horses were gone. The strong ones, the fast ones, the young ones with clean legs and bright eyes had all sold before noon, hauled off by ranchers who paid in folded bills and never glanced back. What was left at the far end of the pen was a different story entirely. 32 of them, thin in a way that went beyond lean, sick in a way that went beyond tired, standing on legs that shook with the effort of holding their own waistcoats, dirty and dull eyes that had gone somewhere past empty into something that had no good name. "Well," the auctioneer said, pulling a rag across the back of his neck, "I reckon we've come to the sorry end of things." He didn't bother raising his voice. There wasn't much crowd left to raise it for. 32 head, culled stock, old, broken, or worm-ridden. Ain't one of them worth the rope they're tied with. He looked out over the thinning yard. "Somebody give me $1 just to clear the pen." Nobody moved. $1, he said again, waited. 50 cents and I'll throw in the ropes." A man near the rail spat into the dust. "Wouldn't take 'em if you paid me Hollis. That's Crowley's throwaway string. He ran 'em half to death already." At the name, heads turned. Nathaniel Crowley stood at the edge of the yard with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his hat pushed back off his forehead. He was 53 years old, broad across the shoulders, and had the particular ease of a man who had spent decades being the largest thing in every room he walked into. He owned more cattle and more grazing rights than any 3 ranchers in Black River Valley combined, and he wore that fact on his face the way other men wore a scar. Plain, permanent, not something he thought about anymore because he didn't need to. "They ain't throwaway," Crowley said. "They're finished. There's a difference." "What happened to 'em?" somebody asked. "Nothing happened to 'em." His jaw set. "They're weak. Bad blood. I bred better and I cut the weak ones loose same as any man with sense would. You don't feed what can't earn its feed." He looked down the line of shivering animals with something close to contempt. "A hard season sorts the strong from the useless. That's just God's own arithmetic." There was murmuring at that, agreement mostly. Men nodded. In a valley where the creek water was already running low and the grass had gone to straw 2 weeks early, nobody wanted to argue resource allocation with a rich man. "Who'll give me $1? The auctioneer called. Silence. 50 cents. Nothing. He sighed, lifted his gavel, ready to call the whole thing dead and go home to supper. $2. The voice came from the back of the yard, clear and steady and unmistakably a woman's. Every man left in the pen turned to look at once. Clara Bennett was 27 years old. She stood at the far rail with her chin level and 2 silver coins held out in front of her like she was making an offering at a church. She wasn't entirely sure would accept her. She wasn't a large woman. She wasn't dressed like money. Her sleeves were pushed to the elbow, her skirt had dust along the hem, and her hands, when a man looked close, were the hands of someone who had been working hard for years and expected to keep doing it. For a moment, the yard was completely still. Then the laughing started. It began with one man low and disbelieving, and it caught and spread through what was left of the crowd, the way a match catches dry grass in August. Men slapped their thighs. Someone whooped from the back rail. Someone else called out, $2, ma'am. Hell, he'd have given 'em to you for free. I heard the lady the auctioneer said. though even he was pressing his lips together against a grin. $2. Do I hear 250 key? He couldn't hold it. He was already laughing. Well, Lord Almighty, sold to the lady with more heart than sense. Clara didn't laugh with them. She walked forward through the crowd, and men stepped aside for her, the way people step clear of something they can't quite categorize. She reached the auctioneer's stand and set both coins down on the wood one at a time, slow and deliberate, so everybody in earshot could hear them ring. Write it down, she said. Quiet. Final. Yes, ma'am. He was still smiling when he wrote it, but he wrote it. 32 head. Paid in full. That was when Thomas Bennett pushed through from the other side of the yard. He was 34, a full head taller than most of the men around him, with the kind of shoulders that came from years of hauling freight across country that broke weaker men down to nothing. He had come to the auction to buy a length of fence wire and a box of nails. He had not come to watch his wife spend what remained of their savings on the walking dead. Clara. He said it low right against her ear so the crowd couldn't pick it apart. Clara, what in God's name are you doing? Buying horses. Those aren't horses. Those are... He looked at the line of them, and the words failed him for just a second. Half of them won't last the week. Look at them. You can see it. I'm looking, Thomas. Then you see what I see. No. She turned and met his eyes directly. I don't believe I do. The crowd was still watching. Nathaniel Crowley had drifted closer, now drawn the way powerful men are always drawn toward something that confounds them. He stopped a few feet off and folded his arms and let a slow smile settle across his face. Whitaker. He stopped correcting himself. Bennett. He looked at Thomas with the particular expression of a man who doesn't bother remembering names he doesn't consider important. You want to explain to your wife what she just purchased. Thomas's ears went red. He was a proud man, and being addressed that way in front of half the remaining crowd cut deep and clean. She knows what she bought. Does she? Crowley did a slow half-circle around Clara, looking her over with the same appraising eyes he used on cattle he was considering turning down. Ma'am, don't believe we've been properly introduced. Nathaniel Crowley. I run the iron gate up at the north end of the valley. I know who you are, Mr. Crowley. Then you know I raised those animals. Fed 'em, wormed 'em, doctored 'em when doctoring was worth the trouble. He tipped his hat, and there was mockery folded into every inch of the gesture. And I'm telling you out of pure Christian charity that you have just thrown $2 good into a hole in the ground. Those horses are dying, all 32 of them, and there is not one thing on this earth that is going to change that. Clara looked at him for a long, steady moment. If they were worth nothing, she said, why did you starve them instead of just letting them go? The smile came off Nathaniel Crowley's face. It was fast there and gone again, but Clara saw it. Thomas saw it. For one beat, the whole remaining yard went still, in a way it hadn't been still before, and it wasn't the laughing kind of still. It was something older and less comfortable. I don't starve my stock, Crowley said. His voice had dropped a register. You want to watch your mouth, ma'am? Then they came to you like this. They came to me weak, and they stayed weak. He stepped back and let the smile return easier now, a performance for the few dozen men still watching. But you go on, take 'em home, and when they're dead in your yard, come Sunday, and you're out $2 and a week's worth of feed, and the labor of burying 32 carcasses in ground too hard to dig, you remember, I stood right here and told you plain. He tipped his hat one more time. Ma'am. He walked off, and the men around him moved with him, the way water moves around a stone, and the auction yard began to empty out in earnest. Clara stood there with the receipt in her hand and 32 dying horses roped to a rail, and for one moment, just one, the fear got hold of her. Because Crowley wasn't entirely wrong. She knew that. She had grown up on a working farm, and she understood what a dying animal looked like, and she was looking at 32 of them all at once. $2. It had felt like courage when she said it. Now, in the quiet left behind by all that laughing, it felt like something else entirely. Thomas stayed. Of course he stayed. He came and stood beside her, and when he spoke again, the anger had drained out of his voice and left only a tired, honest bewilderment in its place. Talk to me, he said. Help me understand what I'm seeing, Clara, because right now I feel like I don't know my own wife. She didn't answer right away. She was looking down the line of them. The dull eyes, the bones showing through dirty coats, the way one gray mare near the middle of the string had her head dropped so low, her muzzle nearly grazed the dust, too exhausted to hold it up. "You remember the string my father kept," Clara said finally, "before the bank took the farm." Thomas frowned. "Your daddy kept mules mostly. He kept horses too. Not fine ones. Hard little horses mountain bred. The kind nobody wanted because they weren't pretty, and they didn't move pretty, and they sure as heaven didn't win races." She was still looking at the gray mare. "You know what they could do, Thomas? They could walk all day through heat that killed a good thoroughbred by noon, up rock and across country that a cow horse wouldn't even try." She paused. "My father used to say the whole world was breeding horses to look at, and forgetting how to breed one that could work." "Dit so?" Thomas looked where she was looking. He was a freighter, not a horseman. But he had hauled enough miles behind enough teams to know a good head from a poor one. "That gray," he said slowly, "she's got a good head on her, even like this." "I know." "It doesn't change the facts, Clara. Good head or not, half of these animals are too far gone. You know that same as I do. I know exactly what I'm looking at." She turned to him and her eyes were wet, but her voice held absolutely steady. "I'm looking at 32 animals that every man in this valley just agreed weren't worth $2. She swallowed once. "And I am the only person standing in this yard right now who thinks they're worth saving." She held his gaze. "If I'm wrong, we're out $2 in a hard week, but if I'm right—" She didn't finish it. She didn't have to. Thomas looked at his wife for a long, long moment. Then he pushed his hat back and blew out a slow breath and looked up at the white-hot sky, like a man requesting patience from a source he wasn't entirely confident was listening. "We're going to need more feed than we've got on hand," he said. Something broke open in Clara's chest. "Thomas, I ain't saying you're right." He held up one hand. "I'm saying you're my wife, and I've watched you be right about things when the whole world was lined up against you, and I am too worn down to bet against you twice in the same lifetime." He looked at the horses and shook his head with the quiet grief of a man surrendering to something larger than himself. "God help us both, Clara. God help us both." It took them the rest of the afternoon to get the horses moving. Some couldn't be led. Some fought the rope out of pure terror, having spent long enough in hard hands to believe that a human touch meant nothing good was coming. Two went down in the yard and had to be coaxed back to their feet. Clara on her knees in the dirt, with both hands flat on a trembling neck, talking low and slow until the animal found the will to stand. The men who had stayed to watch didn't offer to help. "You need a hand there, Bennett," one of them called from the shade, grinning. "Or you got it under control." "We've got it," Thomas said without looking up. "Sure does look like it." By the time they had the whole string strung out on the road toward home, the sun had dropped from white to deep orange, and the horses moved at a shuffle that was barely faster than standing still. Thomas walked at the front. Clara walked at the back, where the weakest ones dragged with her hand resting on the hip of the gray mare, steadying her each time she stumbled. "Easy," Clara murmured. "Easy now. You've got somewhere to be." The mare's ear flicked back toward the sound of her voice. It was a small thing. It shouldn't have meant much. But Clara felt it land somewhere below her sternum, like a promise being made. "You hear me," she whispered. "You're still in there, aren't you?" She kept her hand on the gray hip. "Good girl. Keep walking." They were maybe a mile out from the auction grounds when they heard a rider come up behind them. Clara turned. A man on a solid bay horse, sitting easy in the saddle, coming up at a walk. It took her a moment in the falling light to place the face. James Elroy. 50 years old and weathered past his age, a freight agent Thomas had done contract work for in the leaner years before the ranch had found its footing. He slowed his horse to match their pace and looked down the line of shuffling animals with an expression Clara couldn't read. "Heard about the auction," Elroy said. Clara braced herself for what came next. But Elroy didn't laugh. He just looked slow and careful, the way a man looks when he's actually trying to see something rather than just confirm what he already thinks. "That gray," he said at last. "The one your hand's on. Where did Crowley say he got that string?" "Said he bred them," Clara answered. "Said they were weak stock, bad blood." Elroy made a sound in his throat that wasn't quite a laugh. "Did he?" It wasn't a question. "You know something different." He was quiet a moment, looking at the gray mare with an expression that had gone very still. Recognition, or something close to it, moving behind his eyes. "I know Nathaniel Crowley didn't breed that animal," he said finally. His voice dropped low enough that the drifting wind nearly took it. "I know that for a fact, ma'am. Because I know the brand that's underneath the one he burned over top of it. And I know the man who put that original brand there." Clara went completely still. Her hand tightened on the mare's hip. Then how did she end up in a throwaway string? Elroy straightened in his saddle. He looked at Clara, and he looked at Thomas, and he looked back down that shuffling line of animals, and something moved in his face that aged him and settled him at the same time. "That," he said quietly, "is a real good question, and I don't think you're going to like the answer once you find it." He gathered his reins. "You get those horses home, and you keep them breathing. Every last one. Because if they're what I think they are—" He paused. "Crowley didn't run them through that auction to be rid of them, ma'am." He turned his horse toward town. "He ran them through to make sure nobody ever knew he had them." And he rode off into the darkening evening, and left Clara standing in the middle of the road with her hand on a dying mare's neck and her heart slamming against her ribs. Thomas came back down the line to her. "Clara, what did he mean by that?" She didn't answer for a long moment. She was looking at the gray mare, at the good head James Elroy had seen, at the deep, dull eye that even now, even half-starved and shaking, held something in it that wouldn't go all the way out. "I don't know yet," she said softly. She clicked her tongue, and the whole tired string of them leaned into the ropes and shuffled forward through the summer dusk, toward a small ranch on land nobody had wanted. Owned by a woman nobody had believed, carrying between them a secret that a very powerful and very frightened man had paid good money to make disappear. Clara walked at the back where the weakest ones were. She did not take her hand off the gray mare the whole way home. They lost the first horse before sunrise. It was a black gelding one that had gone down twice on the road home, and each time found the will to stand again. This time it didn't. Clara came out in the first gray light to a yard that had gone too quiet, and she knew before she reached him. She knelt in the dirt beside him anyway, put both hands flat on his cold shoulder, and stayed there a while without moving. "One," she said when Thomas came out and found her. "Clara, I'm counting Thomas, that's all. I want to know the number. I want to look at it straight." He crouched beside her. "You did everything a body could." "I got him home," she said. "I didn't get him well." She stood and wiped her hands on her skirt and didn't let him see her face. "Get the shovel, and let's be quiet about it. The others are scared enough of people as it is." That was the first real thing she learned about her 32 horses. They weren't only sick, they were afraid of hands, of rope, of a voice raised even slightly above a murmur. Someone had spent considerable time teaching them that human beings were a thing to be survived, not trusted, and that lesson had gone in deep. By noon, she had them sorted by condition. The strongest turned into the near pasture, where the grass still held some color. The middle horses kept close to the barn, where she could work, feed into them twice a day, and the worst 9 held inside in the shade on clean straw, where she could reach them through the night hours if she needed to. The gray mare was one of the 9. "You're going to work yourself into the ground," Thomas said that evening, watching her carry the 4th water bucket of the day. "I'll rest when they do." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." She set the bucket down and turned to him, and for just a second all the effort dropped away, and he could see how tired she truly was. "Thomas, if I lose them, I want to lose them knowing I left nothing on the table. Nothing. I can live with dead horses. I cannot live with lazy ones on my conscience." He didn't answer that. He just took the bucket out of her hands and carried it himself, By the end of the first week, they had lost 3 more. 4 horses in the ground and 28 still breathing, and Clara was walking the ranch like a woman made of wire and stubbornness. She had stopped counting out loud. Thomas noticed that. He noticed, too, that she had started naming them instead, the way you name something you have decided to fight for, because a name is harder to let go of than a number. The gray mare she called Hope. "Why Hope?" Thomas asked. "Because that's what she is," Clara said. She didn't look up from the mash she was mixing. "She's what I've got left of it right at this moment." Hope was the one Clara worried over most, and Hope was the one who scared her worst, because on the 4th day the mare stopped eating. And a horse that stops eating has made a decision, and it isn't always the right one. Clara sat with her that night. Didn't leave. Sat on an overturned grain bucket in the dark, with her hand resting on Hope's neck, and talked to her the way you talk to someone who's given up on an argument you need them to keep having. "I know you're tired," she said. "I know somebody taught you that fighting wasn't worth the trouble, but I'm asking you to be wrong about that just one more time. Just eat, and I'll take it from there. I'll do the rest. You just have to eat." The mare didn't move. "You were still standing," Clara whispered. "In that whole auction yard with every man there ready to write you off, you were the one still on your feet. I saw it. That's why I picked you. So don't you lie down on me now." Somewhere past midnight, Hope turned her head slow and deliberate and lipped at the mash in Clara's palm. Clara cried then. Quiet, so Thomas wouldn't hear. She had held it in through 4 burials and a week without real sleep, and the particular loneliness of being the only person in Black River Valley who believed she hadn't made a terrible mistake. And it was a half-starved gray mare eating out of her hand in the dark that finally broke her open. "Good girl," she said over and over. "Good girl, good girl, good girl." Outside the valley had already made up its mind about Clara Bennett. She learned the shape of that opinion the following week when she drove into town for feed, and the conversation at the mercantile stopped the moment she pushed through the door. The way conversation stops when it's been about you and hasn't finished. Old Garrett behind the counter weighed out her oats slowly, and when she asked about a second sack, he looked at her over the tops of his spectacles with the particular expression of a man delivering bad news he considers a kindness. "You sure you can carry the note on a second sack, Mrs. Bennett?" "I've always settled my account here, Mr. Garrett. That ain't what I asked." He set the first sack on the counter between them. "I heard about your buy at the auction. Whole town heard. And I'll tell you what I'd tell my own daughter, ma'am. A person's got to know when they're throwing good money after bad. I'll take the second sack. Mrs. Bennett. I have the coin today, Mr. Garrett. What I choose to do with my own oats is my own business." Her voice was level, quiet, final. He gave it to her. But she felt the eyes on her back the whole way to the door, and she heard just as it swung shut behind her a woman's voice low and carrying, "Poor Thomas. Married a dreamer, and now she's dreaming him straight into the poorhouse." Clara stood on the boardwalk with the afternoon sun beating down on her, and her jaw set so tight it ached. She had a rule now about crying in town. She'd made it 3 days ago, and she intended to keep it. She waited until she was a mile out on the road home, then she pulled the wagon up in the shade of a cottonwood and sat there and let herself shake for 2 minutes exactly. Then she wiped her face and clicked the team forward and didn't look back. What she didn't know was that Nathaniel Crowley had been watching that exchange from across the street. He sat his horse in the shade of the feed store overhang with an expression that had nothing in it of the amusement he'd worn at the auction. Because Nathaniel Crowley had not slept well in 8 days. He told himself it didn't matter. 32 half-dead animals in the hands of a poor ranch wife. What was that to a man running 2,000 head? Let her bury them. Let her learn the lesson the hard way, the way hard lessons got learned out here. In a month she'd be broke and humbled, and the whole ugly business would fade out and be forgotten. But he kept thinking about the gray mare. He kept thinking about the one question Clara had asked him in the yard. The question he hadn't been able to answer clean. If they were worth nothing, why did you starve them instead of just letting them go? Because the truth, Nathaniel Crowley had not said out loud to a single living person, was that he hadn't bred those horses at all. He'd bought the entire string 14 months earlier from a struggling widow 2 counties east, whose husband had died and left her holding animals she couldn't feed and a mortgage she couldn't carry. He had bought the lot for nearly nothing, meaning to sell them on at profit. And only after he'd gotten them home and had a real horseman look them over did he understand what he had stumbled into. The bloodline. The old endurance line that men in the territory had believed bred out of existence nearly 2 decades back. The line that came from the legendary breeder Samuel Whitmore, who had spent 30 years crossing desert stock with mountain horses to create animals that could travel extreme distances in killing heat and come out the other side sound enough to do it again tomorrow. The cavalry had wanted Whitmore's horses desperately. The freight lines had wanted them. Whitmore could have died one of the richest men in the territory, but Whitmore had died suddenly, and the bloodline had scattered, and over the years the story had softened into something between legend and rumor. Until those 32 horses had walked off a widow's property and into Nathaniel Crowley's barn. And Nathaniel Crowley had made a decision. Because a man who owned that bloodline and let it be known would have every cavalry buyer and freight contractor in 3 territories riding to his gate. And Crowley didn't want that. He had spent 30 years building the iron gate on cattle and grazing rights, and the particular kind of power that came from being the man who controlled the beef supply in Black River Valley. If it got out that the real future of the Western transport wasn't beef at all, that it was a string of hard little horses that could go where cattle couldn't and do what cattle couldn't, the whole shape of his world would start to shift under his boots. So he had made sure the bloodline died with him, starved them down until they looked like nothing, burned new brands over the old ones, run them through the low end of a valley auction as culls in a lot timed for the tail end of the day when no serious horseman would still be standing at the rail. It should have worked. It would have worked. If some fool ranch wife hadn't spent her last $2 saving the very thing he had paid to erase. Mr. Crowley, he came out of it. His foreman, a lean, hard man named Briggs, had ridden up alongside him while he was watching Clara's wagon disappear up the north road. "You've been sitting here a while," Briggs said carefully. "Something wrong." Crowley gathered his reins. "The Bennett woman. How many of those horses has she lost?" "Word is 4 so far. Rest are hanging on." Briggs paused. "Won't last, though. Farm wife nursing culls. She'll break before they do." Crowley looked a long moment down the empty road where Clara's wagon had been. "See that she does," he said. Briggs looked at him. "Her feed, her credit, her water rights." Crowley's voice went flat and quiet in the particular way it went when he had made up his mind about something. "I want to know every note she owes and everything she needs. A woman in her position is 1 bad month from finished." He turned his horse back toward the iron gate. "I just want to be certain the month comes." Briggs understood him. Briggs had understood men like Nathaniel Crowley his entire working life. "Consider it done," he said, and the thing that began quietly as a rich man's caution became in the weeks that followed something uglier and more deliberate than Clara Bennett had yet imagined possible. Because a frightened man protecting a secret is a different creature entirely from a merely cruel one. A cruel man has a bottom. A frightened man protecting his whole world does not. Clara didn't know that yet, but she was about to find out. It started small. That was the thing about what Nathaniel Crowley did to Clara Bennett. It started so small that a person could almost convince themselves it was coincidence. The banknote on the Bennett property came due the 2nd week of August, same as it had every year for the past 4 years. Clara drove into town to pay the interest, same as she always had with the coin counted out the night before, and wrapped in a cloth in her coat pocket. But this time, the clerk behind the counter, young Harmon, who had always been pleasant enough and had never once given her trouble, looked at his ledger and then looked at her with an expression that was apologetic, in the way that means the apology is for show. "The terms on your note have been reviewed, Mrs. Bennett," he said. "The rate's been adjusted. Payment due is now 1.5 times what it's been." Clara set her hands flat on the counter. "On whose authority?" "The bank's, ma'am. These things get reviewed periodically." "They've never been reviewed before?" "Times are hard." He wouldn't meet her eyes. The bank has to protect its position. She paid it. She had no choice. It cleaned out nearly everything she had set aside, and she drove home with the empty feeling of a woman who has just watched a door close quietly behind her and heard the lock turn. 3 days later, old Garrett at the mercantile told her without looking directly at her face that he couldn't carry her feed on account anymore. Cash only going forward. Nothing personal, just tightening up. The economy, he said. Everybody was feeling it. The week after that, the man who held the water lease on the creek running the north edge of their property, a lease Clara's family had held uncontested for 20 years, sent word that the lease was being called in. If she wanted to keep access to the water, she'd need to pay the full year in advance, by the end of the month. She didn't have it. She was nowhere near having it. Clara sat at the kitchen table that night, with the accounts spread in front of her, and the lamp burning low, and she felt for the first time since the auction yard, the floor tilting under her feet. Thomas stood at the window with his arms crossed. There was a stillness in him she had learned over 6 years of marriage to be careful of. Thomas was slow to anger, but the slow kind meant that when it came all the way through. "It's him," Thomas said. "We can't prove that. I don't need to prove it to know it." He didn't turn from the window. "Bank feed store water rights, all inside 3 weeks. That's not hard times, Clara. That's a boot on our throat." Knowing it doesn't pay the note, Thomas. She pressed her fingers to her eyes. "If I lose the water rights, I can't hold the horses through summer. There's no other water source on this land I can count on without hauling, and hauling costs money we don't have." He knows that. Of course he knows it. She stopped, took her hands away from her eyes, and looked at the table without seeing it. Something was moving in the back of her mind, slow, half-formed. "Thomas." "What?" "Think about what you just said." She looked up at him. "A man like Nathaniel Crowley does not spend 3 weeks quietly squeezing a ranch wife over 32 horses he stood in public and swore were worthless. He doesn't do it. He'd have forgotten those animals existed by now if they were truly what he said they were." She was on her feet now, the tiredness burning off her, the way it had in the auction yard. "He's frightened, Thomas. He is genuinely frightened of these horses, and a man does not get frightened of something worthless." Thomas turned from the window slowly. They looked at each other across the small kitchen. "Elroy," Thomas said. "That first night on the road. He said Crowley didn't sell them to be rid of them. He said Crowley sold them to make sure nobody knew he had them." Clara reached for her coat off the hook by the door. "I need to find James Elroy." She found him 2 days later at the freight depot on the edge of town, going over a manifest with a stub of pencil. He looked up when her shadow crossed the doorway, and something in his face said he had been half expecting her. "Mr. Elroy?" She didn't waste time. "You told me on the road that night that I wasn't going to like the answer when I found it. I've come to find it, and I've got a rich man calling in every note I owe, so I'd be grateful if you'd stop talking in riddles and tell me plain what I bought." Elroy set down his pencil. He looked at her a long moment and then looked past her out the depot door, up and down the road the way a man looks before he says something he's not entirely sure he ought to. "How's the gray mare?" he said. "Alive, eating, starting to put weight back." Clara's chin came up. "Her name is Hope." Something moved through Elroy's face. "Hope," he repeated softly. Then he shook his head once slowly, like a man absorbing something he'd long since stopped expecting. He came around the counter and lowered his voice, though there was no one near. 20 years ago, he said, there was a man named Samuel Whitmore, bred the finest endurance horses this territory ever produced. Desert stock crossed careful over 30 years horses that could travel 100 miles in heat that killed anything else on 4 legs. The cavalry wanted him. The freight lines wanted him. Whitmore could have named his price and retired wealthy. He paused. But Whitmore died sudden, and the bloodline scattered, sold off, split up, lost track of across 3 territories, until most people figured it had either bred out or was never quite as good as the stories said. Clara's heart had picked up a harder rhythm, but it didn't breathe out. No, ma'am. A good portion of that line came down through one string of horses that got sold and sold again and finally landed about a year back with the widow of Whitmore's own foreman. Woman didn't know what she had, couldn't feed them. Sold the whole lot for near nothing to the first man who came with cash. The name sat in the air between them unspoken for just a second. Crowley, Clara said. Crowley. Elroy nodded. And here's the thing about Nathaniel Crowley, Mrs. Bennet. His whole life is cattle. His grazing rights, his land holdings, his standing in this valley, every bit of it rests on cattle being the foundation of everything. A smart man with Whitmore's line could make that foundation look very old-fashioned, very fast. Freight cavalry contracts the whole territory pushing west. The money's going to follow the Endurance, and it is not in Longhorns. He held her gaze steady. So he had the future sitting in his own barn, and instead of using it, he decided to bury it. Clara felt the whole shape of it settle onto her at once. The size of it, the weight of it, the cold, elegant cruelty of it. He burned Whitmore's brand off them, she said slowly, so the line couldn't be traced, and ran them through the low end of an auction as culls timed so no real horseman would be at the rail. Elroy's mouth was grim. That's what you bought for $2, Mrs. Bennet. You bought Samuel Whitmore's Endurance line, the finest horses in the West, right out from under the one man who spent real money making sure they'd never draw another breath. The depot was quiet around them. Somewhere outside, a wagon rolled past on the packed dirt street. Clara stood very still. She felt the whole thing settle into her bones like cold water. The danger of it. The impossible luck of it. The weight of what she was now holding, and what it was going to cost her to hold it. That's why he's squeezing me, she said. He can't buy them back without admitting what they are. Can't be seen to want them. So he's got to break me instead. Get me desperate enough to sell cheap or lose them to the bank so they scatter again and die out for real. You're not fighting a neighbor, ma'am. Elroy shook his head. You're fighting a man protecting his whole kingdom. Clara stood there a moment longer. Then something came into her face that Elroy hadn't seen on her before. Slow, cold, absolutely certain. 32 horses, she said quietly. Or what's left of them. Every freight line and cavalry buyer in the territory would want them if they knew what they were. Elroy went very still. Mrs. Bennet, he's counting on nobody knowing Mr. Elroy. That is his entire plan. Keep it quiet. Keep it buried. Keep me broke and desperate until the horses die out and the whole thing is forgotten. She looked up at him. So the way I beat him is not quiet at all. You go loud about this and you make yourself a target. He's got money and men and half the town already in his pocket. He could ruin me. A short, hard sound that was almost a laugh. Mr. Elroy, he has already called in my banknote, cut my credit, and taken my water rights. There is not a great deal of ruining left for him to do. She stepped closer. You said the freight lines and the cavalry would want these horses. You're a freight man. When Hope and the rest are sound, and they will be, will you put your name to what they are? Will you tell the truth about that bloodline to the men who'd pay for it? Elroy looked at her for a long, searching moment. Then slowly, something that might have been a smile settled across his weathered face. The first real one she had seen from him. Samuel Whitmore was a friend of mine, he said quietly. I rode for him back when. I watched his line get scattered and buried and laughed off, and I never thought I'd live to see the day. He stopped, cleared his throat. Yes, ma'am. When those horses are sound, I will put my name to it, in front of God and the cavalry and Nathaniel Crowley himself. He put out his hand. Clara shook it, and something was sealed between them in that dusty depot that neither of them had any intention of going back on. She rode home with the whole shape of it clear in her mind for the first time. She knew what she had. She knew who she was fighting. And she knew for the first time since the auction yard that she was not fighting entirely alone. But knowing what she had and keeping hold of it were two very different problems. And Nathaniel Crowley was not a man who sat still while a farm wife pieced together the thing he had paid to bury. She found that out 4 nights later when Hope screamed. There is no other word for the sound a horse makes when it is genuinely terrified. It goes right through sleep and yanks a person bolt upright before they have any thought at all. Clara was out of bed and on the stairs before she was fully awake. Thomas 1 step behind her with the rifle, and when they came through the door into the yard, the smell hit them first. Smoke. The near pasture fence was burning. Someone had run a line of coal oil along the rails in the night and set it alight, and now the whole side of the corral where the strongest horses were kept was a wall of fire. The horses were slamming against the far rails in blind panic, and if that fence went, they would scatter into the dark and the rock, and Clara would never get them all back. "The far gate!" Clara screamed. "Thomas, get the far gate open. Drive them toward the barn." He was already running. Clara ran the other way straight at the fire because the water trough sat at that end, and the horses nearest the flames were the ones closest to breaking. She grabbed the empty feed sacks from the fence post, plunged them in the trough, and started beating at the burning rails, and the heat took the breath clean out of her lungs. And behind her, Thomas was hauling the gate and shouting the horses toward it, and the noise and the smoke and the terror were all one single roaring thing. It was Hope who broke the panic. Clara didn't see how it happened. She was half blind from smoke and couldn't turn around. But later, she would swear to it. Later, Thomas would swear to it, that the gray mare came out of the barn on her own, came through the milling, crashing, terrified string, set herself at the front of them, and moved toward the open gate at a steady walk, and the others followed her, the way frightened animals follow the one that isn't afraid, because that is the oldest instinct there is, and it goes down deeper than panic. The whole string poured through the gate into the safe pasture beyond and away from the fire, and Clara beat the last of the burning rails down to smoking char and collapsed against the fence post with her hands blistered and her face black and the smell of coal oil still thick in the back of her throat. They saved every horse. They saved the barn. They did not catch the men who set the fire. By the time it was beaten down and Thomas went looking, there were only boot prints in the dirt beside the road and the sound of horses ridden hard and fast and gone. Thomas came back to her side. His voice was shaking, and it was not from the cold. "That's not squeezing anymore, Clara. He tried to kill them. He would have killed you if you hadn't woken up." Clara looked out at the pasture where Hope stood at the head of the herd in the gray pre-dawn light, ears up, alive, steady. She had led 31 horses out of a burning corral in the dark while she was still less than 2 months off the auction floor. Still thin. Still rebuilding. And she had not hesitated for a single breath. "He didn't just try to kill my horses," Clara said. Her voice when it came was something Thomas had not heard from her before. Not grief, not anger. Something colder and quieter and more absolute than either. "He made a mistake." She turned to him. "Up until tonight, nobody in this valley knew what I had or cared enough to ask. But you don't set fire to a woman's fence over worthless culls, Thomas. You don't run coal oil down the rails in the middle of the night over animals that don't matter." She looked back at Hope standing still and calm in the gray dawn. "Somebody is going to ask why. And when they ask why, I am going to be ready to answer." By morning, the whole valley knew there had been a fire at the Bennett place. In a small country, smoke carries, and so does talk. By the time Clara drove into Black River Valley at midday, with her hands wrapped in strips of clean cloth, the story had already run ahead of her and sprouted versions. Some said it was an accident. Some said Clara had set it herself for the insurance. And some a quiet careful. Some had begun asking the question she had known they would eventually ask. Who burns a fence over worthless horses? She drove straight to the freight depot and found James Elroy already standing in the doorway as if he had been watching the road. "I heard," he said, coming down the step. He looked at her bandaged hands, and his jaw tightened. "How bad?" "We didn't lose one," Clara said. "Not a single horse." She got down from the wagon. Hope led them out. Something moved through Elroy's face that he didn't entirely manage to hide. And you? I'll heal. She looked at him steadily. Mr. Elroy, I need you to tell me something, and I need you to tell me plain. Last night a man tried to burn 32 horses alive. That is not a neighbor being difficult about water rights anymore. How far will Crowley go? Elroy was quiet a moment. You want the truth? I have had enough of anything else. Then the truth is as far as he has to. Elroy lowered his voice. Nathaniel Crowley is not a wicked man by his own understanding, Mrs. Bennet. That is exactly what makes him dangerous. He is a frightened man who has convinced himself he is protecting something legitimate. His land, his name, the order of things as they are supposed to be. A wicked man you can shame. A frightened man protecting his whole world has no bottom to him, because in his own head he is the one being wronged. Every step of the way he will tell himself you forced his hand. Clara took that in. Then I cannot fight him quietly. No, ma'am, you surely cannot. And I cannot fight him with money because he has all of it. No. So I fight him with the one thing he cannot buy or burn. She looked up at Elroy directly. The truth about what these horses are out in the open in front of people he cannot reach. Elroy studied her. Then he nodded, slow and deliberate. The Cavalry Remount Board comes through Fort Dawson in 6 weeks, he said. They're buying endurance stock for the western posts. Every breeder in 3 territories is sending their best animals. If you were to bring Whitmore's line to that board sound and proved... He stopped. 6 weeks, Mrs. Bennet. Can you get 30 horses sound in 6 weeks? Clara thought of Hope, thin still but eating, standing at the head of the herd in the smoking dawn. I got them out of a fire last night, she said. I reckon I can get them to a fort. She drove home with her bandaged hands on the reins and the plan taking shape in her mind like something that had always been there, waiting for her to be ready to see it. 6 weeks. It was not much time. It was all the time she had. And Nathaniel Crowley was not finished. He came to the ranch himself 3 days later. Clara was walking the fence line with Thomas, both of them replacing the burnt rail section by section, when she heard the horses on the north road. 4 of them. Crowley in front on his big blood bay. Briggs at his shoulder, 2 hired men behind. They came at a walk unhurried the way men come when they want you to have plenty of time to think about being afraid. Thomas straightened beside her. His hand moved toward the rifle leaning against the fence post. Leave it, Clara said. Clara. Leave it, Thomas. That's exactly what he wants. A reason. She set down the rail she was carrying and wiped her bandaged hands on her apron. Let him talk. Crowley drew rein a dozen feet off and looked at the burnt fence. The raw new rails. Clara's wrapped hands and shook his head with an expression of such perfectly constructed sorrow that she nearly admired the craftsmanship of it. Mrs. Bennet, he said, I heard about your trouble. Terrible thing a fire. Dry summer like this a body can't be too careful with a lamp. It wasn't a lamp, Mr. Crowley. He raised his eyebrows. No. Well, I'm sure the sheriff will look into it. He let that sit a moment, knowing full well, and knowing she knew he knew that the sheriff was his man, same as the bank and the feed store. He let her feel the whole weight of it before he moved on. I didn't ride out here to talk about your fence, though. I came to make you an offer, a generous one, on account of I feel for your situation. I'm listening. $200. He said it the way a king drops coin in front of a beggar. Cash money today, for the whole string. 32 horses, whatever's still alive. He leaned on his saddle horn. That's 100 times what you paid, ma'am. More money than you'll clear in a year of working this ground. You take it, you pay off your note, you keep your land, and you walk away from a fight that you are not going to win. I'd call that Christian mercy. Thomas made a sound low in his throat. Clara didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Crowley, and she let the silence stretch out, and she watched his face while she did it. The small tightness around his eyes, the way his fingers worked the rein without him seeming to notice. $200, she said at last. For worthless culls, for putting an end to your trouble. She tilted her head, That is a remarkable sum for animals you stood in public and swore weren't worth the rope they were tied with, Mr. Crowley. She took one step toward his horse. In fact, I've been doing the arithmetic. $2 is what I paid. 200 is what you're offering. That is 100-fold return on animals you called finished. Now why would a smart man, and everyone in this valley will tell you Nathaniel Crowley is a smart man, pay $200 for something worthless? The tightness around Crowley's eyes spread through his whole face. I'm offering it to be rid of the eyesore, he said, and to help a neighbor. No, you're not. Clara held her ground. You're offering it because you are frightened, because you know exactly what these horses are. You knew when you starved them down. You knew when you burned Samuel Whitmore's brand off their hides. And you knew when you ran them through the low end of this auction, praying nobody who understood horses would look twice. She stopped, kept her voice level and cold and absolutely clear. You buried the finest endurance bloodline in the American West because it scared you, Mr. Crowley. And now a ranch wife has got it, and it scares you considerably worse. For one long moment, nobody in the yard moved. Briggs's hand had drifted toward his hip. One of the hired men shifted his weight in the saddle, and Nathaniel Crowley looked down at Clara Bennett from the back of his blood bay horse, and the false sorrow drained out of his face entirely, and what was left underneath was something much older and much colder. You want to be very careful, he said quietly, about the accusations you throw at a man in front of witnesses. I have witnesses of my own, Mr. Crowley. That landed. She saw it land. His eyes moved just for an instant, running through names and possibilities. James Elroy, Crowley said. That broke old freighter at the depot. That's your witness. James Elroy rode for Samuel Whitmore, Clara said. He knows that bloodline the way you know your cattle. And he is not the only one who remembers what Whitmore bred. That last piece was a gamble. She had no one else in mind. But she said it flat and certain, and she watched it hit him, watched the doubt bloom behind his eyes, watched him wonder how many and who and what they knew, and whether she was bluffing. Crowley gathered his reins. The false sorrow was gone, and it was not coming back. 300, he said. Final offer, and you'd be a fool to turn it down. No, Mr. Crowley. Clara's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You cannot buy them back because buying them back means admitting what they are. And you would sooner lose the money than admit it. So you are stuck offering me money you do not want to spend for horses you swear are worthless. And every dollar you add to that offer tells this whole valley the truth you are trying to keep buried. She stepped back. Offer me 1,000. Offer me 10,000. The higher you go, the louder you say it yourself. Now get off my land. The rage that came into Crowley's face was not performed. It was the real thing, and it was considerable. You listen to me, he said, and every last trace of the smooth, wealthy, reasonable neighbor was gone. I built this valley. There was nothing here, nothing before I brought cattle onto this grass and made something out of it. And I will not stand by and watch some dreamer tear down 30 years of work over a string of half-dead horses. I will see you broke. I will see you off this land. I will see you. Before you let me what? Clara cut in. Prove the future doesn't belong to you anymore. Crowley went white. It was the truest thing anyone had said to him in a very long time, and she had said it in front of his own men, and there was no answer to it because it was true, and he knew it was true, and that more than anything was what he could not forgive. He wheeled his horse so sharply the animal half reared. 6 weeks, he said from the saddle, looking down at her. You've got that remount board in your head. Fort Dawson, I can see it. Well, you go right ahead and dream about it, ma'am. Because you'll never get 30 horses sound in 6 weeks on the feed you can afford on the water I control with the whole valley knowing you for a fool. His chin came up, and if by some miracle you manage it, a great deal can happen to a woman driving a horse string over open country. A great deal of accidents out where there's nobody to see. He rode off with his men behind him and left the threat hanging in the summer air like the smell of coal oil. Thomas came to her side. Emma, he just threatened your life, he said. His voice had gone absolutely flat. In front of his own men. His own men will swear black as white for him. Clara said. She was still watching the road where they had gone. "But we heard it, and I want to think about something." She turned to Thomas. "How does he know about Fort Dawson? How does he know about the remount board?" Thomas went still. "I only told you," she said. "And James Elroy. That was it. Nobody else." She heard her own voice go quiet in the way that meant her mind had landed on something it didn't want to be true. "Somebody told him Thomas." They looked at each other, and the same cold thought moved through both of them at the same moment. "Someone close enough to know," Thomas said. Clara turned back toward the barn, toward the pasture where Hope stood at the head of the herd in the afternoon light, watching the road with pricked ears. She wanted to believe it wasn't Elroy. She refused to let herself believe it was Elroy. He had shaken her hand. He had promised, and she had believed the promise. But James Elroy was also a poor man working out of a depot that was half in Crowley's pocket already, and Nathaniel Crowley had money, and money had bent better men than a broke old freight agent. She lay awake with it that night and the night after. And on the third night, she decided she could not stand the not knowing any longer, and she saddled up before dawn and rode into town to look James Elroy in the eye. She never got the chance to ask him, because when she came through the depot door, Elroy was already deep in a low, urgent conversation with a stranger, a lean, trail-dusty man in a cavalry coat with sergeant's stripes on the sleeve. The moment Elroy saw her, his whole face changed, and he came to his feet fast. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, "I was going to ride out to you this evening." His voice was tight with something she couldn't read. "This here is Sergeant Miles Doyle Remount Service. He rode in yesterday ahead of the board." He looked at her, and his expression said, "Brace yourself." "And he's got news you need to hear." The sergeant stood. He was maybe 50 gray at the temples, with a face that had been surprised by nothing in a very long time. "Ma'am," he said, "Elroy tells me you're holding Whitmore stock. That true?" "It's true. James Elroy can prove it. He rode for the man." Doyle glanced at Elroy, then back at Clara. "That's what he says. Trouble is, ma'am, one man's word won't be enough." He set his hat on the counter. "The board is not just buying horses this year. There's a government contract behind it, remounts for 4 western posts, 3 years running. Whoever wins that contract is set for life, which means every breeder from here to the California coast knows the stakes. And when that kind of money sits on a table, people dispute bloodlines, papers, provenance, who bred what, where the line came from." He looked at her steady and level. "You bring in horses and claim they're Whitmore stock with no papers, and one old freighter to vouch, and any breeder who wants that contract will stand up and call you a fraud, call you a woman passing off culls, and without hard proof, the board has no choice but to weigh their word against yours." Gone. The floor tilted under Clara for the second time in as many weeks. "There are no papers," she said. "Crowley burned the brand. There's nothing." "Then you've got a problem," Doyle said not unkindly, "because everything turns on proof, and right now you don't have any." Clara stood there and felt the trap of it close around her for the very first time. The beautiful, merciless precision of what Crowley had done. He hadn't just buried the bloodline. He had made it unprovable. Burned the brand, scattered the widow, run the horses as culls so that anyone who came forward with the truth would sound like a liar or a fool. She could have the finest horses in the American West, standing in her barn, and no way on God's earth to prove it in front of a government board. "There has to be something," she said. She was thinking out loud now, pressing hard against the edges of the problem. The widow Elroy mentioned, the woman who sold the horses to Crowley. She'd know where they came from. "Gone west," Elroy said. "Oregon last anyone knew. Whitmore's own records. Burned when his property burned 20 years back. That's part of why the line got lost to begin with." He shook his head. "There's no paper, Mrs. Bennett. There never was any that survived." Clara pressed both palms flat on the depot counter and made herself breathe. She looked at the wood grain of the counter, and she let herself sit in the impossible shape of it for exactly as long as it took her to see the way out. And then, slow and certain, she lifted her head. "Sergeant Doyle," she said, "you said the board disputes bloodlines, papers, provenance. But that isn't really what the cavalry is buying in the end, is it? At the end of the day, the army doesn't want a pedigree certificate. It wants a horse that can carry a trooper 100 miles through killing heat and come out the other side sound enough to do it again tomorrow. Doyle's eyes sharpened very slightly. That's right. Then paper is not the only proof. Clara straightened. You can dispute a bloodline on paper. You can call a brand a forgery. But you cannot argue with a horse that does what no other horse on that ground can do. She looked from Doyle to Elroy and back. What if I don't try to prove their bloodline on paper at all? What if I prove it the only way that cannot be bought or burned or lied about by putting Hope against the best horses those other breeders bring, and letting the board see with their own eyes what Whitmore bred? The depot went very quiet. Doyle looked at her for a long moment. A distance trial, he said slowly. Horse against horse, over open country in the heat. The truth that lives in the horse itself, Clara said. The truth that Nathaniel Crowley cannot touch. Doyle rubbed the line of his jaw. The board does run trials when there's a dispute that can't be settled otherwise. He was thinking hard now, working through it. But ma'am, you'd be putting a horse that was half-starved 6 weeks ago against animals that have been bred and conditioned and campaigned by men who do nothing else. If your mare breaks down out there, you don't just lose the trial. You prove Crowley right. You prove their culls in front of the whole board, and every soul in the territory will hear about it. I know that. You could lose everything on one horse's legs. I've been losing everything slow for 6 weeks, Sergeant. Clara's voice was quiet and absolutely certain. I'm tired of bleeding out one note and one lease at a time. I would rather stake it all on the truth than watch it drain away. She looked at Elroy. Which horse? Elroy didn't hesitate, not for a single breath. Hope, he said. She's still the thinnest of the lot, but she's the truest. He held Clara's gaze. You told me yourself she led the whole string out of a fire thin as she still is. That mare has Whitmore's whole line beating in her heart. If any horse alive can prove what they are, it's her. He paused, and the honesty in his face was the kind that doesn't come easy to a man. But 6 weeks to bring a mare that far off condition up to running a distance trial against the best stock in 3 territories, Mrs. Bennett. That's what we've got, Clara said. So that is what we'll do. And that was how the 6 weeks began. The 6 weeks that the Valley would talk about for years after, long past the time when most of the people who had laughed at the auction had grown old enough to be ashamed of the laughing. Clara poured every hour she had into Hope. Every dollar they could scrape together went into good feed and clean hay for one gray mare, while she and Thomas cut their own table to the bone and went to bed with less than they needed, so the horses could have what they required. Crowley still held the water rights, so Thomas hauled water 4 miles by barrel from a neighbor who owed him a kindness, and they nursed that water like it was silver. Every morning before the heat came up, Clara walked Hope, then trotted her. Then as the weeks turned, and the mare's ribs began to disappear under new muscle, and her dull coat came up dappled and silver gray and gleaming, Clara rode her out into the open country a little farther each day, asking the mare's body to remember what her blood had always known, and Hope remembered. By the 3rd week, she wasn't just recovering. She was transforming. There was a morning Clara would remember the rest of her life when she asked Hope for a real gallop across the flat, expecting the careful, half-spent effort of an animal still finding its feet. Instead, the mare dropped her head and opened up, and the ground blurred, and Clara felt the raw and impossible power come up through the saddle, the effortless, ground-eating stride of a horse bred across 30 careful years for exactly this and nothing else. And she started laughing and crying at the same time, because it was real, and it was all real, and she could feel the truth of it right through her hands. "You were in there the whole time," she gasped when they finally pulled up, both of them blowing. "You were in there the whole time, weren't you, girl?" Hope tossed her head, and somewhere on the north end of the valley, in the big house at the Iron Gate, Nathaniel Crowley received a report from Briggs that the Bennett woman's gray was looking less like a cull with every passing day. And he stopped sleeping altogether. And he began to understand that squeezing a woman's credit and threatening her on the road was not going to be enough. And so, 5 days before the board convened at Fort Dawson, he reached for the last card he had left. Clara came out at first light to find Briggs Crowley's own Foreman leaning alone on her corral fence, watching Hope move in the early morning quiet. Thomas came out behind her and reached for the rifle hanging just inside the barn door. "Don't," Clara said. "Clara, don't." She walked out into the yard. "Mr. Briggs, you're a long way from the iron gate." Briggs didn't turn right away. He watched Hope a moment longer with an expression that Clara couldn't immediately name. When he did turn, what was on his face was not threat. It was not performance. It was something she had seen before on Thomas's face, on the faces of the men who came to her late and apologetic and ashamed. It was a man who had reached the bottom of himself. "That is a hell of a horse," Briggs said quietly. "She is." He turned his hat in his hands. "I've ridden for Crowley 11 years, ma'am. Done things in that time I ain't proud of. That fire." He stopped, started again slower. "I didn't light it. But I knew who did, and I didn't stop it. And in the eyes of God, that is the self-same thing as lighting it yourself. I know that. I've known it since the night it happened." Clara said nothing, waited. "He's planning something for the drive to Fort Dawson," Briggs said. "Men set to meet your string out in the breaks, where there's no witnesses. Scatter your horses or worse." He swallowed. "He told me to be one of them." The yard went dead silent. "And you came here instead," Clara said. "I got a limit," Briggs said. "Took me 11 years to find it, but I got one." He looked up at her. "I'll tell you where his men will be posted so you can go around them. That's the only decent thing I've got left to offer." He started to turn away, then stopped. "One more thing. Even if you get past his men on the road, even if you get to Fort Dawson, he's planning to be there himself, standing right in front of that board." Briggs's mouth was grim. "The moment your mare lines up, he intends to swear before the whole remount service that she's stolen, that you bought a horse that belonged to him and you're running her as your own. He's got 2 men set to back the claim." Clara went very still. "A rich rancher's word against a farm wife's," Briggs said. "You know how that goes. Even if Hope runs the legs off every horse on that ground, he'll call her stolen at the finish line. And he's got the standing to make it stick." He mounted up and rode off without another word, and left Clara standing in the early dawn with the last and most brutal piece of Crowley's plan laid bare before her. She could get the horses sound. She had. She could get past his men on the road. Now she could. She could win the trial. She believed with everything in her that Hope could win it. And none of it would matter, because at the finish line in front of the whole board, Nathaniel Crowley would stand up and call Hope stolen, and a rich man's sworn word would take the mare from her hands at the very moment of victory. Clara stood there in the quiet yard. She looked at Hope, who lifted her head and looked back with her ears pricked and her dark eyes bright and calm. And Clara began very slowly to smile. Because Briggs had just told her every single piece of Crowley's plan. And a plan you know about isn't a trap anymore. It's a mistake that hasn't happened yet. "Thomas," she said, not taking her eyes off Hope. "Saddle up. We're riding to find Sergeant Doyle. Today." Her smile held. "Because if Nathaniel Crowley wants to stand up in front of the United States Cavalry and swear an oath about this horse, I am going to make absolutely certain he does exactly that. Out loud, on the record, in front of every witness in the territory." She turned to Thomas, and her eyes were shining. "He has spent 6 weeks trying to keep the truth buried," she said. "He is about to stand up in front of the one audience in the world he cannot buy and say it out loud himself. We are not going to run from his lie, Thomas." She looked back at Hope one last time. "We are going to let him tell it, and then we are going to bury him with the truth." Sergeant Doyle heard her out in the back room of the depot, with his hat on his knee, and his face doing the careful neutral work of a man who has learned over 30 years of military service not to show what he's thinking until he's finished thinking it. When Clara stopped talking, the room was quiet for a long moment. A wagon rolled past outside. Someone called out to someone across the street. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary morning going on around something that was anything but. "Let me be sure I have this right," Doyle said at last. "You want me to allow Crowley to make his claim. You want him to stand up in front of the board and swear on his oath that hope is stolen off him." "I want him to swear it out loud," Clara said. "On the record, before the whole cavalry remount service and every breeder in 3 territories." "Ma'am?" Doyle turned his hat once in his hands. "If he swears it and the board believes him, they take that mare from you on the spot. You understand that. I understand it completely. Then help me understand why you'd want him to make the claim at all." Clara leaned forward. "Think it through with me, Sergeant. Crowley's entire scheme has rested on one thing from the beginning. The bloodline can't be proved. He burned the brand so I couldn't prove their Whitmore stock. He made sure the widow was gone, the records were gone, the paper trail was gone. He did a thorough job of it." She held up one bandaged hand. "But there is a second half to that he has not reckoned with. If he stands up before this board and swears that mare is his, that he raised her, owned her, that she came off the iron gate, then he is the one making a claim of ownership. And a man who claims to own a horse has to be able to prove that." She let it sit for exactly one breath. "He spent 6 weeks making absolutely certain I can't prove she's Whitmore's stock on paper. In doing so, he left himself unable to prove she's his. Because the truth is, she's neither on paper. There is no paper at all. He knows it. That is why he thinks he's safe. He believes the absence of proof protects him because it protects everyone equally." She looked at Doyle steadily. "But it doesn't protect him equally, because I'm not the one making the sworn claim before a government board. He is." Doyle's eyes had begun to narrow in the particular way of a man who is watching something he hadn't expected come together in front of him. "So when he swears," he said slowly, "the board is going to ask him exactly what they'd ask you. Prove it. And he cannot. He burned the only proof that ever existed. All he has is his word, and 2 hired men to back it." Clara's voice didn't waver. "Against which I will have James Elroy, who rode for Samuel Whitmore, and can speak to the bloodline under oath. I'll have you, Sergeant, if you'll stand with me. And I'll have one thing more." She paused. "One thing Crowley cannot answer for, and has never seen coming." "Which is?" Clara told him. Doyle listened without interrupting. And when she finished, the grin that spread across his weathered face was the grin of an old soldier watching a move he would not have thought of himself and wished he had. "I'll be damned," he said softly. "You're not trying to stop him from making the claim at all. You're trying to make him make it. Because the second he does, he's committed. He cannot walk it back. And then I spring it. Then you spring it." Doyle looked at her a long moment. "It's a hell of a gamble, ma'am. If any single piece of it goes wrong, every piece of the last 2 months has been a gamble, Sergeant." Clara stood. "I'm past playing safe. I intend to end this. And I intend to end it in a way Nathaniel Crowley cannot come back from." Doyle stood too. He put his hat back on his head and squared it and held out his hand. "Then let's go make a rich man hang himself with his own rope," he said. "I'll have the county records office send a writer tonight." Clara shook his hand, and it was done. The drive to Fort Dawson took 2 days. They went the route Briggs had told her, not the main road, but a wide loop east through broken country that added most of a day to the journey, but kept them clear of the breaks where Crowley's men waited. Clara rode Hope. Thomas drove the wagon with the remaining 31 horses strung behind, and Doyle rode alongside them in full cavalry uniform, which carried its own kind of weight. Even Crowley's hired hands would think twice about stopping a string with a sergeant of the United States Army riding guard. They saw the men once. On the afternoon of the first day, 3 riders sitting a far ridge to the west watching. Thomas stiffened on the wagon seat. "They see us." "Let them," Clara said. She kept her eyes forward, her hands easy on the reins. "They're a full day's ride from where they were supposed to find us, and there's a cavalry sergeant in our string. They won't move." She was right. The three riders watched for a long while, then turned without coming down off the ridge and were gone. But Clara understood exactly what it meant. Crowley knew by nightfall that his men on the road had failed, which meant he would fall back on his last card, the one at the finish line, just as she'd planned. They came into Fort Dawson on the morning of the trial, and the sight of it pulled the breath out of Clara for just a moment because there were breeders there from across the territory, and horses everywhere, big, deep-chested animals with the clean legs and bright eyes of stock that had been bred and conditioned and campaigned by men who did nothing else in the world. Horses that had never known hunger. Horses that had been groomed and grained and handled by expert hands from the day they were foaled. And here came Clara Bennett, a ranch wife in a faded blue dress on a gray mare leading a string that 6 weeks ago had been dying in her barn. Men stared. Some laughed low the way men do when they believe they're watching something embarrassing. Word had run ahead of her here too. The Bennett woman, the $2 culls, the fool's errand that had somehow not yet ended the way everyone had expected. Clara held her head level and rode through all of it. She felt hope beneath her calm and sound, and moving with the long, easy stride that had developed over 6 weeks of daily work, and she thought laugh now. You have a little time left for it. Nathaniel Crowley was already there. He stood by the board's pavilion dressed in his best talking with the officers, with the ease of a man who has never in his life had reason to be nervous in a room of important people. He looked like exactly what he had always presented himself as a prosperous, respectable cattleman. A pillar. A man whose word was his bond. When he saw Clara ride in, he smiled and tipped his hat. Slow, deliberate mocking. The smile of a man who believes he is holding every card and knows it. Clara tipped her head back at him. Let him think it. The board convened at mid-morning. 3 officers behind a long table. Doyle standing to one side, the breeders and their horses gathered in the wide yard. The senior officer, a gray colonel named Hatchett, laid out the terms plainly and without ceremony. A distance trial. 20 miles over open country in the heat of the day. Horses to go out together finish judged on time and condition both, because the cavalry wanted not just speed, but a horse sound enough at the end to turn around and do it again. That was the whole of it. Before we run, Colonel Hatchett said, looking across the gathered crowd. Are there any disputes to be entered? Any challenge to any animal's standing or ownership? Speak now. I will not have this settled in the courts after the fact. Clara held her breath. Nathaniel Crowley stepped forward. He removed his hat. Grave, respectful, performing sorrow so well you almost forgot it was a performance. Colonel, he said, it grieves me to raise it, but I'm a man of conscience, and I cannot stand silent. He turned and pointed directly at Hope. That gray mare, the one the Bennett woman is riding. That horse is stolen. She's mine. Raised on my ranch, the Iron Gate. She was sold in error at a valley auction some weeks back in a lot of mixed stock, and this woman purchased her for $2 and has been passing her off as her own ever since. I'd ask the board to take her in hand before this trial goes forward. A stolen animal cannot run for a government contract. The murmur that went through the crowd was immediate and low, and carried the particular texture of people who have already half decided what they believe. Colonel Hatchett looked at Clara. That is a serious charge, ma'am. What do you say to it? Clara did not answer him. Not yet. She turned first to Crowley. You swear that Mr. Crowley, before this board on your oath, that this mare is yours, that you raised her, owned her, bred her on the Iron Gate. I swear it. His chin came up. Comfortable. Certain. Raised her from a foal. I'd know that horse anywhere. Raised her from a foal, Clara repeated. Clear. Carrying to every ear in the yard. On the Iron Gate. You are certain. I've said it twice now. How many times does a man have to say a thing? You'd stake your name on it. Standing here before these officers. I have staked it, Crowley said, and there was irritation beginning to show at the edges, now the first crack in the performance. Say your piece, woman, or step aside. Clara turned back to Colonel Hatchett, and her voice when she spoke was measured and calm, and carried to the back of the yard without effort. Mr. Crowley has sworn on his oath before this board that he raised this mare from a foal on his ranch, that she is his own stock bred on his own ground. She paused for exactly one breath. I'm about to prove that impossible. And when I do, I would ask the board to remember that he swore it freely. That I gave him the opportunity to reconsider, and he would not take it. Crowley's smile flickered. Something behind his eyes moved quick and cold, and then the smile came back because he still believed he was safe. He still believed the absence of paper protected him. He had not yet seen what was coming. "Sergeant Doyle," Clara said, "would you bring Mr. Aldridge?" A murmur moved through the crowd. Doyle stepped away and came back a moment later with a bow-legged old man Clara had never met until 2 days ago, when Doyle had brought him to her at the edge of camp with the quiet confidence of a man playing a card he's been holding for exactly the right moment. His name was Peter Aldridge. He was 61 years old and had been a farrier for 43 of them, working horses from the Mississippi to the California coast, and he had the hands and the eyes and the absolute, unshakable professional authority of a man who had looked in 10,000 horses' mouths and was wrong about none of them. "Mr. Aldridge," Clara said, "you have been a farrier for 43 years. "That's right, ma'am. And in that time you have learned to read a horse's age from its teeth, to read old injuries, old work, old history in the legs and feet. It's my trade. Then would you examine this mare in front of the board and tell us her age?" Aldridge came forward without ceremony. He handled Hope with the ease of long practice, gentled her, looked in her mouth with complete attention, ran his hands down her legs, took his time. Nobody in the yard spoke. When he straightened up, he looked mildly puzzled, the way a professional looks when the answer is clear, but he wants to be sure he's being asked for accuracy rather than performance. "This mare is aged, ma'am," he said. 12 years old at the youngest. Could be 14. 12 to 14 years old, Clara said. She turned to Crowley. Her voice was still level, still measured. "Mr. Crowley, how long have you owned the iron gate?" The yard went completely still. Crowley's face had stopped moving. "What's that got to do with—" "How long, Mr. Crowley?" "It is a matter of public record. The colonel can send to the county office for it within the hour. How long have you held that property?" A silence that lasted 3 full seconds, which in front of a crowd that large is a very long time. 9 years, Crowley said. The words came out as if pulled from him against his will. 9 years. Clara let it ring in the air. "You have owned the iron gate for 9 years. You have sworn before this board that you raised this mare from a foal on that ranch. And Mr. Aldridge here, 43 years, a farrier, no stake in this matter whatsoever, tells us the mare is 12 to 14 years old." She turned to the officers at the table. "She is older than his ownership of the land he swears he raised her on. By years. He could not have raised her from a foal on the iron gate. Colonel, it is not arithmetically possible. He has sworn to something that cannot be true." Voce bestimide, DMBD. The yard erupted. Not the laughing kind of eruption. The other kind. The kind that moves through a crowd when something ugly has been turned over in the light and everyone is seeing it for the first time and all at once. Crowley's face had gone from its careful composure through white and was now somewhere between white and a mottled, furious red. "That farrier is mistaken," he said. His voice had cracked slightly at the edges. "A horse's teeth are not a—" "Then bring your own farrier," Clara said. "There are men in this yard who have been working horses for 30 years. Ask any one of them. Ask all of them. Let every horseman here look in that mare's mouth and tell the board her age, and then let them square it with your oath." Nobody moved to defend him, because every horseman in that yard had already looked at Hope at her head, her movement the deep settled quality of an animal in her prime years, and every one of them had already done the arithmetic privately and arrived at the same number Aldridge had said out loud. Colonel Hatchett's face had gone to stone. "Mr. Crowley," he said, and his voice was the voice of a man who has stopped giving chances but will offer one more out of procedural fairness. "You swore an oath before this board not 10 minutes past. Would you care to amend it?" And here Nathaniel Crowley made the mistake. Not a small mistake. The kind of mistake that a proud man makes when he has never in his life been forced to back down in front of other men and does not have the internal machinery for it when the moment finally comes. "I'll amend nothing," he said. The smooth, reasonable neighbor was gone entirely now, and what was underneath was raw and shaking and furious. "That horse is mine. Whatever some broken-down old farrier says about her teeth, I will not stand here and be called a liar by a ranch wife and a government lackey. I know that mare. She came off my land, and I'll swear it to my grave." "You raised her from a foal," Clara said, and her voice had gone very quiet. "You still swear that?" "I swear it." "On the iron gate, which you have held 9 years." "I swear it, damn you." "And she is 14. "I swear it." The last word cracked the morning air like a shot, and Crowley seemed to hear it himself after it left him, seemed to feel the shape of what he had just done. And for 1 second, something very close to fear moved across his face. Then the pride slammed back into place over it like a door, and he stood there breathing hard, and every man in the yard could see it. A rich man cornered, swearing the same impossible thing over and over with more force each time, unable to stop himself digging the hole deeper with every word, because he had never learned how to stop digging. Clara looked at him for one long, quiet moment. Then she turned back to the board. "No, Mr. Crowley," she said. "You didn't raise her." She reached into her coat. "You bought her, along with 31 others, 14 months ago from the widow of a man named Elias Croft, who was Samuel Whitmore's foreman for 22 years, and who kept the last of Whitmore's endurance line together after his employer died until hard times made keeping them impossible, and she sold the whole string to the first man who came with cash in hand." She held up the folded paper. "Sergeant Doyle rode 2 counties east last week," she said, "and he found the record of that sale, signed, witnessed, on file with the county clerk's office. Your name, Mr. Crowley, in your own hand." Doyle stepped forward and held the paper out to Colonel Hatchett. Crowley stared at it. The color had drained out of his face entirely now and left something that was almost gray. "That's a forgery," he said, but his voice had dropped to something barely above a murmur, and it had lost the absolute quality that makes a denial worth anything. "It's filed with the county, sir," Doyle said. "Any man here can ride for a certified copy before sundown." Clara turned back to the board. She had been building to this for 6 weeks through every burnt rail and every called-in note, and every night she had gone to bed hungry so a gray mare could eat, and she was not going to rush it now. "Here is the truth, Colonel," she said, "plain as I can lay it in front of every witness on this ground." Her voice was steady and clear and reached every corner of the yard. Nathaniel Crowley purchased Samuel Whitmore's endurance bloodline 14 months ago. He knew precisely what he had, because a man doesn't pay cash for a string he hasn't had examined. And when he understood what holding that bloodline would mean, that a man with Whitmore's horses could take the future of Western transport clean out of cattle and away from everything he'd spent 30 years building, he made a decision. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The yard was absolutely silent. He starved those horses down until they looked like worthless culls. He burned Whitmore's brand off their hides so the line couldn't be traced back, and he ran them through the tail end of a valley auction on a hot afternoon, praying nobody who knew horses would still be at the rail. She paused. "I was at the rail. I paid $2. And for the 2 months since this man has burned my fence in the night, called in every note I owed, cut off my water in a drought, threatened my life on the open road, and now stands before this board swearing a false oath to take from me the one mare who lived through all of it." "Did you mean Juanjinbe?" She looked at Crowley directly. "He didn't do all of that over worthless horses, Colonel. No man does. He did it because he knew better than anyone alive, better than I did when I bid $2 in that auction yard, exactly what these horses are worth. And what they mean for the future, he was trying to hold on to." The silence that followed was the kind that settles over a crowd when something true has been said in front of people who didn't want to hear it and cannot now unhear it. Colonel Hatchett looked at the document in his hands, looked at Crowley, looked at Clara. And when he spoke, his voice had the cold precision of a man whose patience with dishonesty has been entirely exhausted. "Mr. Crowley, you have sworn an oath before this board which is now demonstrated to be false. You repeated that oath under direct challenge on multiple occasions. That is not a matter I have any discretion to overlook." He set the document on the table with the flat finality of a man closing a door. "This will be referred to the civil authority, and there will be a reckoning for it in the proper venue." He turned from Crowley deliberately, in the way a man turns from something he has done considering. "As to the mare, I find no merit whatsoever in the claim of theft. She will run." He looked back once, and his voice carried the particular edge of a colonel who has made himself clear and intends to stay that way. "Mr. Crowley, remove yourself from this ground before I have you removed." Nathan Crowley stood there, just for a moment, just one, and Clara almost felt it, the thing she was watching happen to him. Because she watched a man become in the space of a few minutes, and in front of every horseman in 3 territories, something he had never been and had never once imagined he could be. Stripped of the name and the standing and the fear and the deference that had been the architecture of his entire life. Stripped of it by his own mouth, because he could not bring himself to back down. He looked at Clara, and for the first time since the auction yard, there was no mockery in his face, no performance. Only the stunned, naked expression of a man watching the world he built come apart and understanding all at once that he was the one who had taken it apart. "You planned this," he said, hoarse, barely above a murmur. "The whole of it. You wanted me to make the claim. I gave you the chance to walk away from it," Clara said quietly. "Twice. You couldn't do it." She held his gaze. "That was never me, Mr. Crowley. That was your own pride. It's had you by the throat from the very beginning, and you never once saw it." He had no answer. There was no answer. He turned and he walked out of Fort Dawson through a crowd of men who an hour ago had touched their hats to him, who now stepped back as he passed, and he mounted his horse and he rode, and he did not look back. Because there was nothing behind him anymore to look back at. The yard was quiet for a moment after he was gone. Then Colonel Hatchett cleared his throat and looked at the remaining breeders with the brisk efficiency of a man who has disposed of unpleasant business and is ready to return to the day's purpose. "The trial will commence in 1 hour," he said. "I suggest everyone water their horses." Clara walked to Hope and pressed her forehead against the mare's neck, closed her eyes. Let herself have one moment, just one before the rest of it. "That was the easy part," she whispered. "You know that, don't you, girl? Beating a liar. Anybody can beat a liar." She drew back and looked into Hope's dark, steady eye. "Now we've got to beat the truth. All those good horses, all those men who came by them honest, every one of them better on paper than you have any business being." Her throat tightened. "You don't have to prove he was lying anymore. You have to prove I wasn't, that I wasn't a fool, that I saw true." Her voice broke just slightly at the edges. 20 miles in this heat, everybody watching. Show them what your blood remembers, Hope. Show them what I saw in that auction yard when nobody else would look." Hope breathed against her, warm and steady and absolutely unhurried. Clara Whitaker swung up into the saddle and rode the $2 mare that everyone had laughed at to the starting line. There were 9 horses at the line, and 8 of them made Hope look like exactly what Nathaniel Crowley had always called her. They were big, most of them. Deep through the chest, long in the leg, with the hard polished shine that comes from months of nothing but good grain and expert handling. Their riders were lean professionals who had campaigned distance horses across 3 territories and knew to the minute how an animal spent itself over 20 miles of open country heat. And beside them stood a gray mare, 6 weeks off an auction floor, ridden by a ranch wife with her sleeves pushed to the elbow and dust on her boots. Clara heard the talk run low through the crowd behind the starting line. "That's the Bennett woman, that gray can't be the same one they were laughing about this morning. Wait till the heat gets in her. She'll quit at 10 miles like all the culls do." A man laughed. $2, he said. Was that $1.98 too much? Clara let it go past her. She had run out of room to carry other people's laughter somewhere between the fourth burial behind her barn and the morning she came out to find her fence burned to char. It had just stopped fitting. Thomas came up on Hope's shoulder in the last moment before the start. He didn't tell her it would be all right. 6 years of marriage had taught him when that would land true and when it would just be noise. He put one hand on Hope's neck and one over Clara's knee, and he looked up at his wife. "Whatever that clock says at the finish line," he said low and for her alone, "you already won the part that counts. You stood that man up in front of the whole cavalry and made him swear a lie and then broke it over his head in front of every witness in the territory. Nobody takes that back. Not ever." His voice caught once, then steadied. "So you don't ride this to prove one more thing to one more doubter. You ride it for the woman who stood in that auction yard with $2 in her fist and saw a horse when every man there saw a carcass. Nobody else has earned a say." Clara looked down at him and her throat closed entirely, and she nodded once because speaking wasn't possible. James Elroy was there at the rail. He lifted 2 fingers off the wood at her. Not a wave. A small private salute, one person to another, across the distance of everything they had staked together on this morning. "Whitmore would have wanted to see this," he said. "Ride her the way he'd have ridden her Mrs. Bennet. Slow to the sorrow, fast to the finish." Slow to the sorrow, Clara repeated under her breath. Fast to the finish. She didn't know exactly what it meant, but it sounded like the truest thing anyone had said to her all morning, which meant it was probably the only instruction she needed. Colonel Hatchett raised his hand at the line. The yard went still. Clara gathered her reins and leaned down close along Hope's neck. "All right, girl," she whispered. 20 miles. Everything the good Lord put in your blood. Let's go remind these people what you are." The hand came down. They went out fast, most of them. The big horses grabbed the front the way Clara had known they would, their riders driving hard off the line, meaning to strand the field early and run the slower animals into the ground before the heat had a chance to do it for them. Inside the first half-mile, the leaders were strung out ahead in a hard pounding knot of flying dirt, and Hope was running near the back, and Clara heard the fresh wave of laughter break behind her before the distance took it. She did not chase. That was everything. That was the whole of the thing that the flashy, well-grained horses didn't know, and the blood in Hope's veins had understood for 30 years of careful breeding. A distance trial is not won in the first mile. It is lost there by the horse that spends itself early like a fool with a full purse. The winner is simply the horse that still has something to give when the sun and the miles come around together to collect what's owed. "Let them run, girl," Clara murmured. She held Hope to her long, low ground-eating stride, the one that covered distance without appearing to hurry. "Let them spend it all up front. We'll be right here when the bill comes due." A rider pulled back to her before the second mile was out. A young fellow on a rangy chestnut sitting easy, his horse still carrying too much early energy sideways. "Ma'am," he called across, grinning under his hat. "You planning to pick up the pace some, or are you aiming to walk it home?" "I'm comfortable, thank you. Comfortable finishes last." "Comfortable finishes," Clara said. "You watch and see which of us is still comfortable at 18 miles. He laughed and touched his hat and let the chestnut carry him back up toward the front. Clara watched him go. Watched the wasted, prancing sideways burn of energy the horse was spending on nothing. And she thought that's one. That horse will be done by 12 miles and its rider doesn't know it yet. By the 5th mile, the field had begun to sort itself the way fields always do in heat and distance. 3 of the horses that had gone out hardest were already laboring, dropping off the front, as the early speed leaked out of them mile by mile, like water out of a cracked jug. Hope had moved up through the back of the field, without seeming to try passing the stragglers 1 and 2 at a time. Her ears forward, her breathing deep and even, while Clara sat still and quiet and asked her for nothing at all. Steady, Clara breathed. Just like home. Just like the water halls and the morning walks. You've done harder than this on less. Steady, girl. She could feel it happening under her. The mare settling into the long work, the way a thing comes home to itself after too long away. There had been mornings in those 6 weeks when Clara had lain awake wondering whether she was simply a stubborn woman in love with a notion hauling water 4 miles by barrel, and going to bed hungry so a horse could eat chasing a bloodline off the word of an old freight agent. Those mornings had been long and cold and honest in the way the middle of the night is always honest. And now at 5 hard miles, with the sun pressing its full weight down, she could feel every one of those mornings in the tireless, unhurried rhythm beneath her. She hadn't been mad. She had just seen it before anyone else would look. She had just been early. At the 7th mile came the first real danger. The trail cut down through a rocky stretch where the footing turned unreliable, and one of the horses just ahead, a heavy bay that had been running too hard for the ground, went down suddenly on a stone. Its rider was thrown clear into the brush. For one sick instant, the horses bunched behind the fallen animal and shied hard, and the whole knot of them nearly came together in a tangle. Clara felt hope gather to jump, felt the mare's whole body coil in the space of a single stride, and there was no time for thought, only for trust. She dropped her weight, opened her hands, said, "Go," and Hope rose and cleared the fallen bay with a foot to spare and came down on sound ground and never broke stride. "Good girl." Clara gasped, her heart slamming. "Oh, good girl." Behind her, shouting the sound of another horse going lame. 2 more out of the trial in 5 seconds. She didn't look back. She gathered Hope back to the steady rhythm and rode on, and Reed's voice was in her head. Fast to the finish. Not yet. Not yet. By the 10th mile, they were squarely in the middle of what remained, and the rangy chestnut, whose rider had grinned at her at mile 2, was done. Clara came up on him from behind and saw it clearly, the heaving sides, the white lather, thick on the neck and flanks, the rider no longer asking for speed, just sitting grim and still, trying to get the animal home safe. Juno went by them at the exact same pace she'd held from the first stride, not even breathing hard. "Ma'am?" the young rider said as she passed, and the grin was entirely gone from his voice now. "What in God's name are you riding?" "A horse everybody threw away," Clara said. "You have a care with yours. He gave you everything he had." She meant it. She wasn't unkind about it. She just said it and rode on. And then, at 12 miles with the field down to 5 horses, and Hope running third and holding her reserve like a closed fist, Nathaniel Crowley made his last play. Hope's ears went flat before Clara saw anything. The mare threw her head and shied hard left, and Clara, 6 weeks of knowing this horse in her hands, and her seat and her bones went with it without thinking. And a man came up out of the brush on foot as they passed, one of Crowley's men. She knew the face. He had a coiled rope in his hand, and he swung it low and hard at Hope's front legs, meaning to catch her at speed and bring her down. Any other horse in that field would have gone down. Any other rider would have gone with it, but Hope was not any other horse. Clara drove her forward with everything she had. Weight legs, voice, and the mare surged, and the rope caught nothing but the trailing edge of her tail, and they were through and past before the man could gather it for another throw. Clara was shaking. She was running on pure fury and pure terror at once, and she thought wildly, no witnesses. There's nobody out here. And then cold and clear as spring water, yes there is. There's always somebody. She was right. The 4th place horse and rider came through that same stretch 30 seconds behind her. His name was Sawyer, a hard-bitten, sun-dried veteran breeder who had been running distant stock since before Clara was born, and who had laughed at the starting line same as everybody else. Sawyer saw the man in the brush, saw the rope, saw the throw. And Sawyer, who had no love for Clara Bennett and no prior reason to do her any favors, was nonetheless an honest man and a horseman. And there was exactly one thing an honest horseman could not stand, which was a coward trying to bring down a sound animal in the middle of a fair trial. But Clara didn't know that yet. She only knew her hands were shaking, and the mare beneath her had just spent a burst of speed she could not afford to have spent, and they were 8 miles from the finish. "Easy," she told Hope, and told herself at the same time. "Easy. Back down, back to the rhythm. We can't spend it. We're not there yet." And the good mare came back to her, dropped back into the long reaching stride. Clara pressed one hand flat to the gray neck and said low and fierce and steady, "I've got you. Nobody puts you down. Not today. Not ever. You just run, and I'll do the worrying." The heat was the real enemy now, past all the rest of it. It came up off the ground in waves and pressed down from above like something with weight and intention. And Clara could feel it reaching into the horses ahead and pulling them apart the way hard miles and hard heat always pull things apart eventually. This was the thing. This was the exact thing. The thing Samuel Whitmore had spent 30 years of his life bending toward crossing desert blood and mountain blood and endurance blood, with the patience of a man who understood that greatness in an animal is not built in a season. A horse that can still run when everything else on that ground is breaking, not the fastest at a mile. The one still alive and still sound and still going when the flashier animals have cooked themselves hollow. At 15 miles, there were 3 horses left in front of her. At 18, 2. At 20 miles, 1. The big black, the best of all the professional strings, and Clara could see him ahead of her now, could see his rider looking back over his shoulder with an expression that had started as annoyance and was becoming with each closing stride something closer to disbelief. And beneath Clara, at 20 hard miles in the full weight of the Montana Territory summer, the gray mare was just now beginning to ask a question. Clara felt her gather, felt her offer the thing she had been holding in reserve this whole long way, the deep reserve that 30 years of blood had put in her, and that no amount of starvation or neglect had managed to touch. Clara answered it the only way there was to answer it. She loosened her hands. She leaned down along the gray neck. "Now, girl," she said, and it came out half a sob. "Now, everything. Show them what your blood remembers. Show them what I saw." Hope dropped her head and ran. And it was not the desperate spending run of the horses broken behind them. It was something else. A long, low, ground-devouring flood of a stride that came from somewhere 30 years and 10,000 careful decisions deep, and it ate the last of the distance like it was nothing. Like it had always been nothing. Like the 20 miles before it had been merely the question, and this was the answer, and the answer had been inside her the whole time. Clara felt it come up through the saddle and into her chest, and she was laughing and crying at once, with the wind tearing the tears sideways off her face, and hope running underneath her, with the kind of effortless, absolute power that you feel maybe once in a lifetime, under your hands, if you are very lucky and very stubborn and very willing to look past the ribs. They ran the black down inside a half mile. His rider heard them coming. You could hear that stride coming, the earth drumming with it, and he looked back, and Clara watched his face come apart at the sight of what was closing on him. He asked his black for everything. The black gave what it had. It wasn't enough. Nothing on that ground that day had enough. And then a quarter mile from the finish line, with the crowd already on its feet and the win as good as hers, the last fright came. The worst of them, because it came from inside. Clara felt the hitch. Just a flicker. Half a beat of unevenness in that flawless flooding gallop there and gone. The kind of thing a rider feels in her seat before her mind can name it. A stone flung up maybe. A small wrench. And Clara's whole body went cold. She knew what she was supposed to do with a winning horse a quarter mile off the finish. She knew what every rider there would do. You hold the advantage. You run it home. You take the win. And she knew what she had promised a gray mare in a dark barn in the worst of the summer. "No," she said out loud. "No, not now, girl. Don't you be hurt now." And in the space of 3 strides, Clara Bennett made the decision that, though she didn't know it yet, was the one the whole United States cavalry had truly come out to see a rider make. She sat up. She gathered her hands. A quarter mile from the finish line of the trial that would decide everything she owned and everyone who had ever laughed at her, she began to bring hope down. Ready to pull up. Ready to lose it all. Ready to throw the win away rather than run a hurting horse one single stride further than was right. "Whoa now," she said, broken-hearted. "Whoa, girl, it's all right. We'll walk it in. I don't care about the—" And hope fought her. The mare took hold of the bit and threw her head and lengthened right back into that reaching, flooding stride sound as a bell, no hitch in it at all. Whatever it had been, a stone, a stumble, A ghost in Clara's imagination, it was gone, and the mare was whole, and she wanted to run. She had waited her whole hard life for one person to see what was in her. And the ground was open, and the finish was right there. And every ounce of Samuel Whitmore's 30 years was singing in her blood, and hope was not about to be walked home. Not now. Not by anybody. Not even by the woman she loved. And Clara Whitaker, laughing and weeping, gave her back her head. "All right," she sobbed. "All right, girl. You're sound. You're sound. Then go take it. It was always yours." Hope crossed the finish line 4 full lengths clear. Then this was the thing. This was the whole thing the cavalry had come the long way to see. Clara pulled Hope up past the finish line, and the gray mare came back to a walk square, sound, breathing hard, but not broken. Her legs clean and true beneath her, her head up, her eye bright. Ready. Clara would swear it to her last day on this earth that Hope in the moment after crossing that line would have turned around and run the whole 20 miles over again for the pure satisfaction of it. The other horses came in behind 1 and 2 at a time, most of them wrecked, some lame. Every single one spent to the absolute floor of what it had riders sitting still and hollow-eyed on animals that would need 3 days of rest before they could be asked to do anything more demanding than stand in a field. And there at the finish stood the gray mare that 8 weeks ago had been dying in a barn on land. Nobody had wanted cool-headed and clear-eyed and sound the living breathing. Undeniable proof of everything Samuel Whitmore had bred and everything Clara Bennett had seen when not one other soul in that auction yard would raise a hand. Sergeant Doyle reached her first. He came at something close to a run and grabbed Hope's bridle and dropped to one knee in the dirt and ran his old cavalry hands down each of the mare's legs. In turn felt the tendons check the feet, listened to her wind. When he stood up, his weathered face was doing something it was working hard not to do. "Sound," he said. The word came out of him like he'd been holding it in. 20 miles in this heat 4 lengths clear, and she is cold sound. He shook his head slowly, the way a man shakes his head when he's seen something he knows he'll be telling about when he's old. "Mrs. Bennett, do you understand what you have standing here on the end of this rein? There is not a horse in the entire United States cavalry that can do what this mare just did. Not one. Not close." "I've had a fair idea, Sergeant," Clara said, and her voice broke clean in half on it. "I've had a fair idea since the auction yard." She was still sitting it all in when old Sawyer rode in 4th place and swung down off his blown horse and walked straight past Clara entirely and went directly to Colonel Hatchett at the line. He took his hat off, and he held it in both hands, and he said it loud enough for the board and half the remaining crowd to hear every word. "Colonel, before another thing is said about this trial, there is something I am bound to report and will swear to on any book you set in front of me." Sawyer's jaw was set with the particular tightness of an honest man who has seen something he cannot let go past. 12 miles out in the broken country, there was a man in the brush alongside the trail. He laid an ambush for the gray mare, threw a coiled rope under her at speed, meaning to bring her down and break her neck and her rider with it. "I saw the whole of it clear as I see you right now, Colonel." He stopped, drew a breath. "I don't know that woman. I laughed at her horse this morning same as everybody else standing on this ground. But I know a coward when I see one try to bring down a sound animal in the middle of a fair trial, and I will not stand quiet about it." His chin came up. That man wore the Iron Gate brand, same as the 2 who stood before this board this morning swearing the mare was stolen. The murmur that moved through the crowd was a different sound than the laughing had been. Colder, heavier. The sound a crowd makes when something ugly has been confirmed rather than revealed. Colonel Hatchett's face had gone to absolute stone. "You'd swear to that the man wore Crowley's brand." "On my mother's grave, Colonel." Hatchett turned and looked out at the road where Nathaniel Crowley had ridden away in disgrace an hour before. And when he spoke, his voice carried to every ear on that ground without him needing to raise it at all. "Let it be entered with the rest," he said. "Perjury before this board. Conspiracy to bring down a horse and kill a woman on a government trial. He paused, shook his head, once the single slow shake of a man arriving at a conclusion he finds genuinely hard to believe. Whatever remained of Nathaniel Crowley's name in this territory after this morning, there will be none of it standing by the time the civil authority is through with him. Then he turned back to Clara, and the stone went out of his face, and what replaced it was something quieter and rarer. The expression of a man who has just witnessed something in 31 years of service he was not expecting to witness and knows it. "Mrs. Bennet," Colonel Hatchett said, "I have judged this trial fair and complete. Your mare has won it, and won it in a manner I cannot find words adequate for after 3 decades in this army." He stepped forward from the table. "I will tell you now in front of all these witnesses what I intend to do about it, because it is the honest thing, and by God, ma'am, you have earned honesty if any soul alive ever did." The yard was absolutely silent. "That 3-year remount contract," he said. 4 Western posts. The one every breeder on this ground crossed a territory to win. He held her gaze directly. "I want it filled with this bloodline. However many horses you can breed and prove out of this mare and her kin, the United States Cavalry will buy at a fair and standing price for as long as you are able to supply them." He allowed himself the smallest, driest of smiles. "You came onto this ground this morning a ranch wife nobody believed in, Mrs. Bennet. You'll ride off it the most important horse breeder in this territory." He looked at Hope. "I'd call that a fair morning's work for $2. Clara stood there holding Hope's rein, and for a long moment she could not make a single word come. She thought of the auction yard, the 2 silver coins in her fist, and the whole yard laughing. She thought of the first grave, the black gelding cold in the dirt before sunrise, and the 3 that followed him. She thought of waking to smoke and running barefoot through the dark toward a wall of fire. She thought of the notes called in one by one, the water cut off the miles of hauled barrels, the table cut to nothing so a gray mare could eat. She thought of every neighbor who had looked away, every whispered word about poor Thomas, married to a dreamer. She thought of a rich and frightened man who had held the whole future in his own barn and called it worthless and tried with everything he had to bury it. And she thought of a thin gray mare in an auction yard, who had been too exhausted to lift her head, but had not lain down, had not quit, had simply stood there in the dirt and the heat and the laughing, waiting to see if one person in the whole wide world would trouble to look. "Colonel," Clara managed at last. "Thank you. I'll fill your contract, and I'll fill it honest with the finest horses this country has ever put under a saddle." She laid her hand flat on Hope's neck. Because that's what she'd want. She always did just want to run. Thomas reached her then. He came through the crowd, and he didn't say a word, because there were no words equal to the moment, and he was a man who understood that. He just wrapped both his arms around his wife right there in front of the colonel and the board, and every breeder in 3 territories, and he held her while she shook. And Clara pressed her face into his shoulder and let herself at last, after 2 months of holding every single piece of it together with her bare hands, come completely apart in the arms of the one man who had doubted her twice and stood beside her anyway. "You were right," he said into her hair, and his own voice was not steady. "God forgive me, Emma. You were right about all of it. The horse is the head and not the ribs, every last word you said in that auction yard while I stood there calling you mad." He drew back and held her face in both his hands and looked at her, and he didn't care who saw what was on his face. "I should have seen it. You saw it plain as day, and I stood there and saw dying horses. How did you see past that?" "Because you saw dying horses, Thomas," Clara said, wiping at her face with the heel of her hand. "That's no failing in you. Everybody with sense saw dying horses that day. There wasn't a sane man in that yard who saw anything else." She looked past him at Hope, standing sound and steady, with the whole afternoon sun on her gray coat, calm as she had ever been. "I just couldn't stop looking at the one that was still standing, the one they'd all already buried in their heads. She was standing, Thomas, half dead and shaking and still on her feet, and I have never in my life been able to walk away from a thing that was still standing." The news of what happened at Fort Dawson reached Black River Valley before Clara did. That was the way of it in a small country. The same wind that had carried the laughing carried the reckoning home ahead of her. By the time she drove her string back up the North Road 2 days later, the valley already knew that the $2 culls had turned out to be the last living branch of the finest endurance bloodline in the American West. Knew that the Bennett woman held a 3-year cavalry contract that would make her ranch the most significant horse operation in the territory, and knew this above every other thing that Nathaniel Crowley had stood up in front of the United States Cavalry Remount Board and sworn a false oath and been shown a liar and a cheat before every horseman in 3 territories, and had sent a man to commit murder on a government trial, and had ridden away from Fort Dawson with his name lying in ashes behind him. The people who had laughed came now. They came the way people always come after the fact, sheepish shuffling hats turning in their hands' eyes that couldn't quite get up to meet hers. Some came to congratulate her, and some came only to be seen doing it, and some, the honest ones, and there are always some honest ones, if you wait long enough, came to say plainly that they were sorry. Old Garrett from the Mercantile drove out himself. He stood in Clara's yard and could not, for a long while, make himself look at her directly. "I cut your credit, Mrs. Bennett," he said, finally, when the silence had gotten too heavy to carry. "When Crowley leaned on me, I cut it. And I knew in my heart it was wrong the very minute I did it, and I did it anyway because he was Crowley, and you were—" He stopped, swallowed. "You were you, and I told myself it cost me nothing to do a rich man a small favor, and squeeze a woman everybody already reckoned a fool." He turned his hat around and around. "I was ashamed of it that day. I've been ashamed of it every day since. And I've come to say it to your face, which is more than I did the first time." Clara looked at the old man for a long moment. She had carried the memory of that afternoon in his store, the talk stopping when she walked in, the eyes on her back. The woman's voice about poor Thomas and his dreamer wife carried it through 6 of the hardest weeks of her life. And she found standing in her own yard, with a cavalry contract in her coat pocket, and a sound gray mare in her barn, that she had no wish to hand it back to him. "You were afraid of him, Mr. Garrett," she said. "Same as near everybody in this valley was afraid of him. Fear makes people small. I watched it make a rich man do things a great deal worse than cut a woman's feed credit. I watched it nearly burn 32 horses alive." She put out her hand to him. "You came out here and said it to my face. That counts for something." Her voice was level and without performance. "Your account is good at my ranch, and mine is good at your store. And that is the whole and entire end of it between us." Garrett took her hand in both of his, and the old man's eyes filled up, and he drove home a good deal lighter than he'd arrived. Not everyone came asking. Not everyone earned such grace. But Clara found, as the weeks turned into months, that she simply did not have the room inside her to carry grudges. She was too busy. A 3-year cavalry contract and the last of the Whitmore line did not manage themselves, and Clara Whitaker had real work to do at last. The kind she'd been built for. The kind she'd seen coming in a dusty auction yard when it was still just 2 coins and a crazy notion and a mare too tired to lift her head. She hired the men who needed work. Not the easy hires, the ones who came with clean records and good references. She hired the ones nobody else would take. The old. The down on their luck. The ones the valley had already written off the same way it had written off her horses, because Clara Bennett had learned something about writing people off, and she had learned it the hard way, and she was not going to forget it. Hope recovered the full weight she had lost, and then some. By late fall she moved through the pastures with the deep, unhurried confidence of a horse that has found its place in the world, and sees no reason to doubt it. She was, as Clara told anyone who asked, the finest animal she had ever sat on, and the truest heart she had ever known. Whitmore's other horses recovered too, all of them. Every one that had survived the auction floor, and the starvation, and the fire, and the 6 brutal weeks of rebuilding. They came into themselves the way things come into themselves when they are finally given room, gradually, completely, with a quiet authority that made men who had laughed at the $2 culls fall silent the first time they saw the string moving across the near pasture in the morning light. James Elroy rode out one afternoon in early fall and stood at the fence and watched them for a long while without speaking. Clara stood beside him and let him look. "Amos would have wept," Elroy said finally. He meant Whitmore, though he used the man's first name, which Clara had never heard him do before. He spent 30 years building that and died thinking it was all going to scatter to nothing. He shook his head. He'd have wept, and then he'd have laughed, and then he'd have asked you where you learned to read a horse's head. My father, Clara said. Smart man. Smart enough. He just never had the land to do anything about it. She looked out at Hope, who was moving at a slow, majestic walk along the far fence, with 3 of her foals from the previous spring coming along behind her. I had the land. I just needed to find the horses. Elroy smiled. $2? He said. $2? Clara agreed. And for a moment there was nothing more to say, because $2 contained all of it, the whole impossible story, and they both knew it. It was in that same early fall, on a gray morning with rain threatening from the northwest, that the man rode up the lane and got down, and stood in the yard, and held his hat in his hands. Clara was in the barn, and heard the hoofbeats, and came out, and she recognized Briggs before he spoke. He looked 10 years older than he had the last time she'd seen him, which had been in her yard in the dawn, warning her about Crowley's plans. He looked like a man who had been living with something heavy and had not slept well under the weight of it. I don't expect you'll take me on, Briggs said without preamble. He kept his eyes somewhere around her boots. Not after what I'd done, what I stood by and let be done to you and these horses. He stopped, started again. The fire. I didn't light it, but I knew the man who did, and I said nothing. And I know that is the self-same thing in God's eyes. I've known it since the night it happened. He finally looked up at her. I rode for Crowley 11 years. I did what he told me, and I told myself it was just work, just earning my wage, and I stopped asking myself questions about it a long time back because the answers weren't comfortable. He pressed his lips together. I got a limit, turns out. Just took me 11 years to find it. Clara looked at him. This hard-worn, hollowed-out man who had helped Nathaniel Crowley try to destroy her, and who had then come into her yard at the gray of dawn and told her the truth at the cost of everything he had. She had thought about Briggs more than once in the weeks since Fort Dawson, about what it had taken for a man like that to make the choice he made, and what it had cost him after. Crowley would have known by noon that his own foreman had warned her. Briggs had ridden away from the iron gate that morning and kept riding, and what he'd ridden away from was the only life he'd known for 11 years. You warned me, Clara said, when it mattered more than anything else on this earth. You rode into the yard of a woman you had wronged, and you told her the truth, and you did it knowing exactly what Nathaniel Crowley was when he felt crossed. She held his gaze. A man finds his limit and acts on it. That is not a small thing, Mr. Briggs. That is the whole of what character means when it comes down to it. Briggs's jaw worked. He didn't speak. I need a foreman, Clara said. One who knows horses to the bone. One who knows his own conscience better still. She nodded toward the barn, and the pastures beyond green now, and full of good horses moving in the morning quiet. The wages are fair, and the work is honest, and there is not a person on this place who will ever be asked to do a thing in the dark they can't own in the light. You start Monday, Mr. Briggs, if you'll have us. Briggs stood there with his jaw working and nothing coming out of it. Then he ducked his head fast and put his hat back on and turned toward the barn so she wouldn't see his face, and walked off with his shoulders squared and his back straight. He was the best foreman the Bennett Ranch ever had. Still there 20 years later, the most loyal man Clara ever hired, and he never once to the end of his days forgot who it was who had handed him back his own self-respect on the very morning he had finally thrown it away for good. As for Nathaniel Crowley, the Iron Gate did not outlast the year. A man's power in a small country does not rest on money alone. It rests on his name, on other men's belief in him, on the particular quality of fear and deference he can command simply by walking into a room. And Nathaniel Crowley had burned every last scrap of that down to white ash with his own mouth in front of the cavalry in a single morning. The neighbors who had deferred to him for 30 years stopped deferring. The creditors who had never dared press him began to press, quietly at first, and then not quietly at all. The perjury charge came to something, and the conspiracy charge behind it, And though a rich man's lawyers kept him out of a jail cell, they could not keep his name out of the mud. And in a small country, a ruined name is a ruin more complete than any prison. The great cattle empire he had starved horses and burned fences and lied before God and government to protect came apart. And it came apart not because Clara Bennett tore it down, but because the thing that had truly been holding it together had never once been the cattle. It had been belief, the shared, unquestioned belief of every soul in the valley that Nathaniel Crowley was a great man. And that belief had died at Fort Dawson, killed by his own pride in front of 100 witnesses who would never again touch their hats to him on the street. He sold out and left the valley before the next summer's grass came up green. Clara never saw him again as long as she lived, but she thought of him from time to time across the good years that followed. Not with hatred. She had let the hatred go somewhere on the long, weeping, joyful ride home from Fort Dawson, in the space between crying and laughing with Thomas on the wagon seat, while Hope walked easy at the lead. And she never went back and picked it up again because she found she had no use for it, and it only weighed a person down. She thought of him the way a person thinks of a lesson learned young and never once forgotten. Because Nathaniel Crowley had held the whole future of the West in his own 2 hands, the finest horses that would ever cross that country, everything the changing territory would soon and desperately need, and he had tried with all his considerable strength to destroy it, every last head of it, rather than let go of the one small world he already knew and ruled. He'd had greatness standing in his own barn, and he'd called it worthless because greatness frightened him, and change frightened him worse. And in fighting so hard to bury it, he had in the end buried nothing on this earth but himself. The years were good to the Bennett Ranch, so very good. The Whitmore line flourished beyond anything even James Elroy had dared hope for in that dusty depot, when he had first told Clara the truth about what she'd bought. Hope's offspring went to cavalry posts across the Western Territories, carried troopers across country that killed the horses sent before them. They hauled freight over distances no ordinary team had crossed before. They became in the fullness of time exactly the legend that Samuel Whitmore had spent his life building toward, and Nathaniel Crowley had lain awake nights in terror of. Men came from across the territory to buy Bennett horses. The better ones among them came also for Clara's counsel, and she gave it freely, gave it most freely of all to the ones who needed it most. The widows and the struggling farmers and the young people, starting with nothing, and the ones the rest of the world had already decided were finished. Because Clara Bennett had learned something in a dusty auction yard on a burning summer afternoon, and she had spent the rest of her life living by it. One afternoon, perhaps 3 years after Fort Dawson, a young woman came to the ranch. She was barely 20, thin, uncertain in the way of a person who has been told too many times that she doesn't know what she's talking about. She had bought a small string of horses nobody in her county wanted, and her family thought she had lost her mind. And she had ridden 2 days to find the woman who had once bought 32 dying horses for $2 and turned them into the most celebrated bloodline in the territory. Clara sat with her on the porch for 2 hours. She told her everything: the laughing, the fire, the called-in notes, the nights of going to bed hungry so the horses could eat. She told her about the black gelding who died before sunrise and the 4 graves behind the barn. She told her about Briggs appearing at the corral fence, in the gray dawn hat in his hands. She told her about the moment she almost pulled Hope up a 1/4 mile from the finish line, and the moment the mare fought her and ran. The young woman listened without speaking, sitting with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes very bright. "How did you know?" she said finally. "How did you know they were worth saving when the whole world was telling you different?" Clara was quiet for a moment. She looked out at the pasture where Hope moved in the afternoon light. Older now, her muzzle showing gray, her foals from 3 seasons scattered among the other horses in the deep green grass. "I didn't know," she said. "Not the way you mean. I couldn't prove it. I couldn't guarantee it. I didn't have the papers or the bloodline records or anything that would have held up in a court." She watched Hope move that long, unhurried, ground-eating stride unchanged from the auction yard. "What I had was a horse that was still standing. That's all. Half dead and shaking, and her head hanging and still on her feet in a yard full of men who had already decided she wasn't worth looking at." Clara turned to the young woman. I have never in my entire life been able to walk away from a thing that was still standing and still trying. Not when everybody around me told me I should. Not when the arithmetic said I should. Something in me just couldn't do it. She shook her head. So I didn't know they were worth saving. I just knew that if I walked away and they died, I would spend the rest of my life wondering. And I decided that $2 and a hard summer were a cheaper price to pay than a lifetime of wondering. The young woman looked at her for a long time. That's not very practical advice, she said. No. Clara agreed. It isn't. She smiled. Has it stopped you yet? The young woman smiled back, thin, uncertain, a little watery, but real. No, ma'am. Then you already know everything you need to know. Go home and do the work. Hope was 14 years old when she had her finest foal, a gray filly, so precisely her image that Clara stood at the fence the morning after the birth and felt something move through her chest that had no name. Thomas came and stood beside her and put his arm around her shoulders, and they both just looked in the way people look at something that has come full circle. There she is, Thomas said quietly. There she is. Same head. Same head. He tightened his arm around her. Same everything, I think. Clara reached out and touched the fence rail. The filly was up on her feet, already moving alongside Hope with the same long-reaching stride, the same quiet confidence, the same dark, alert eye. She's going to need a name, Thomas said. Clara thought about it for a moment. Grace, she said. Because that's what it was, the whole of it from beginning to end. It was Grace. Thomas nodded. Didn't argue. He rarely argued about the names. That evening Clara walked out to the far pasture alone, the way she sometimes did in the quiet hours after supper, when the work was done, and the light had gone gold and the horses had settled. Hope came to her at the fence, same as she always had, ears pricked, unhurried, recognizing the footsteps, the way horses know the people who have cared for them. Clara put her forehead against the gray neck and stood there with her eyes closed, the way she had in the dark barn all those years ago, on the night the mare had first eaten from her hand. Do you remember that auction yard? She said softly. All those men lined up deciding you were nothing. That auctioneer who couldn't even be bothered to raise his voice. She felt the mare's slow, warm breathing against her. And there I was in the back with $2 silver, and my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my hands, thinking, what on earth are you doing, Clara? What in the world are you doing? She was quiet for a moment. The best thing I ever did, she said. That's what I was doing. I didn't know it yet, but that's what it was. Hope turned her head and breathed against Clara's shoulder, warm and easy, the same way she had breathed against her on the night everything started. The same way she had breathed crossing 4 lengths clear in front of the whole cavalry. The same way she had every morning of every year of a life that had turned out so much larger and so much better than 2 silver coins had any right to buy. And the two of them stood together in the falling evening with a whole good life behind them, and a gray filly in the pasture who was the living continuation of everything they had built together, and there was nothing left between them that needed to be said. The story of Clara Bennett became the kind of story that small countries keep for a long time, the kind that mothers tell their daughters, and that old men bring out at the fire when they want to say something true about the world. The woman who spent her last $2 on 32 dying horses the whole valley had given up on, who was laughed at and threatened and burned out in the night and squeezed to the edge of ruin, who looked past the ribs, clear through to the heart, and refused with everything she had to let the dying thing die. The people who had been there, the ones who had been at the auction yard at the Mercantile at Fort Dawson, told it the way witnesses tell things, with the particular weight of people who understand they were present at something that mattered. Old Garrett told it until he died. Sawyer told it at every gathering of horsemen he attended for the rest of his life, and he was still telling it at 80 years old, still with the same stunned quality in his voice that he'd had that afternoon when a gray mare ran past his blown horse at mile 12 like he was standing still. Even Briggs told it in his later years, though he always told his own piece of it with his eyes on the floor, the part about the fire, the part about the dawn, the part about riding into the yard of a woman he'd wronged and finding out what forgiveness actually looked like when it was real. And what they said, all of them, every time they told it, was this: that there was a woman in Black River Valley back in the summer of '81 who saw what the whole world had thrown away, who was told 100 times and in 100 ways that she was wrong, that she was foolish, that she was throwing good after bad, who buried 4 horses and nearly lost her land and woke up to a burning fence in the dark of night and kept going anyway, who rode 20 miles in killing heat on a horse everybody had given up on, and at the finish line, when it mattered most, chose the horse over the win, and who turned $2 into something that outlasted every last person who had ever laughed at the $2. They remembered her name for it. They were still saying it long after she was gone. Clara Bennett, the woman who looked when nobody else would. Grace was everything Hope had promised she would be. Clara knew it the morning the filly took her first real gallop across the near pasture. Not a foal's clumsy run, but something purposeful and long and utterly unhurried. The same ground-eating stride that had carried her mother across 20 miles of Montana heat and 4 lengths clear of the finest distance horses in 3 territories. Thomas was standing at the fence beside Clara when it happened, and he didn't say anything for a long moment. He just watched the gray filly move and pressed his lips together and shook his head slowly, the way he did when something was too good for words to do it any service. "She's the same," he said finally. "She's the same," Clara agreed. "Same head, same stride, same—" he searched for it. "Same quality of not being in any particular hurry and covering ground anyway." "Whitmore knew what he was doing," Clara said. 30 years of knowing what he was doing. Thomas looked at her sideways. "You knew what you were doing, too. $2 worth of knowing." Clara smiled and said nothing because there was nothing to add to that. The breeding program had grown carefully and steadily over the 3 years since Fort Dawson, in the way Clara did most things, without hurry, without waste, with the particular patience of a woman who had learned that the best things take exactly as long as they take and cannot be pushed faster than their nature allows. She had not tried to flood the market. She had proved each horse individually, the way Doyle had asked, the way the cavalry required, and every animal that left the Bennett Ranch left with a record behind it and a reputation in front of it that money alone could not have bought. The contract with the cavalry had been renewed twice. The horses had proven themselves on posts across the Western Territories, carrying troopers across country that went through the ordinary remount, animals like paper, and the reports that came back to Colonel Hatchett. And from him to Clara, read like something out of the stories Elroy had told her in the depot about what Whitmore's horses had been in their prime. They were exactly that. They were in their prime again. "You rebuilt it," Elroy told her one afternoon, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, watching Grace move in the far pasture. He was older now, slower in his joints, but his eyes were as sharp as they'd ever been, and his voice still carried the precise, unhurried authority of a man who knew his subject to the bone. What Whitmore spent 30 years building, and Crowley spent 1 year trying to bury you, rebuilt it. In 3 years. With 32 horses and $2 and a lot of hauled water. 31 horses, Clara said. "We lost 1 first night." Elroy nodded. He remembered. He always remembered. 31 horses, he said quietly, and 1 woman who wouldn't stop looking at them. Clara wrapped both hands around her own cup. "Did you ever doubt it?" she asked. "That first night on the road, when you rode up and told me about the brand, did you actually believe they could come back? Or were you just—" She considered her words. Hoping. Elroy was quiet for a moment. An honest man's quiet, the kind that means he's actually thinking about the answer instead of reaching for the comfortable one. "Both," he said at last. "I knew what they were. I was as certain about the bloodline as I've ever been certain about anything. But knowing what something is and knowing what it can survive are 2 different questions." He looked at her. "I didn't know if they could come back from what Crowley had done to them. I didn't know if you could hold them through what he was going to do to you when he found out." He paused. "I hoped. That night on the road, I just hoped. But you put your name to it anyway. I put my name to it anyway." He looked at Grace in the pasture. "Whitmore was my friend. I rode for him when I was young and foolish, and the world seemed bigger than it turned out to be. I watched his work get scattered and buried and laughed off after he died, and I told myself there was nothing to be done about it, because that's what you tell yourself when you don't want to pay the price of doing something." He stopped. "You paid the price, I didn't. Seemed like the least I could do was stand behind you while you did." Clara looked at the old man for a long moment. "You did more than stand behind me, Mr. Elroy. You stood beside me." He waved that off in the way of a man who doesn't take compliments gracefully, but appreciates them anyway. "How's Hope?" he asked. Change of subject deliberate and transparent, and neither of them pretended otherwise. "Good," Clara said, slowing down some. "She's earned it." "She has," Elroy said. "Lord God, she has." Hope was 17 that summer, which was old for a horse that had lived the kind of first years she'd lived, but she moved through her days with a dignity and ease that suggested she had no particular opinion about aging and saw no reason to hurry the process. She was gray-muzzled now, softer in her lines, but the head was the same, that good deep, wide-set head that Clara had seen in a dusty auction yard when every man standing at the rail had seen only a dying animal. And the eye was the same dark and clear, and carrying something in it that Clara had never found the right word for in all the years since. Presence, maybe. The quality of a creature that has been through the fire and come out the other side, knowing something about itself that cannot be taken away. Grace was Hope's finest daughter, but she was not the only one. There were 7 of Hope's offspring on the ranch by then, and 4 more that had gone to cavalry posts and freight operations across the territory. And every one of them carried the bloodline true, that stride, that head, that deep and effortless endurance. That was the whole sum of what Whitmore had bred toward and what Crowley had tried to erase. Clara could see Whitmore's hand in all of them, the careful patient, 30-year work of the man who had understood that you could not rush a bloodline, that you could only tend it and give it time and trust what you had built. She had come to understand something about that in a way she couldn't have when she was 27. And standing in an auction yard with $2 silver and a pounding heart. You could not rush a good thing into being. You could only be willing to see it before it was finished. That was the whole of it, really. That was the thing she had done in the auction yard, that none of the men around her had done. She had been willing to see something that wasn't finished yet, and believe in what it was still in the process of becoming. Thomas found her in the barn one evening that fall, sitting on an overturned bucket in the same spot where she had sat through the night all those years ago when Hope had finally eaten from her hand. He had learned over the years that she sometimes needed to sit there, not to do anything. Just to sit there and remember how it had felt in the worst of it so that the good of now never got taken for granted. He leaned against the doorframe. "Elroy's staying for supper," he said. "Good. He's been looking thin." "He's been looking his age." Thomas paused. "Clara, there's a letter." She looked up. "From the territorial governor's office." He held it out. "Came this afternoon." Clara took it. She opened it with the same careful, unhurried hands that had mixed mash for a half-starved gray mare in the dark, that had beaten burning fence rails with wet feed sacks, that had pressed 2 silver coins onto an auctioneer's stand, so everyone in the yard could hear them ring. She read it once, then read it again. Thomas watched her face. "What does it say?" She lowered the letter. "They want to name the new cavalry remount station after the bloodline," she said. Her voice was very even. "The one they're building outside Fort Dawson. They want to call it Whitmore Station." Thomas was quiet for a moment. It's right," Clara said. "It should carry his name. He built it." She folded the letter carefully and held it in her lap. "I'll write back and tell them yes, and I'll tell them to put his full name on it, Samuel Elias Whitmore, so people know who they're talking about." "People know who you are too, Clara. People know what I did," she said. "That's different, and it's enough." She looked down at the letter in her hands. Whitmore spent 30 years building something beautiful and died before he got to see what it became. The least the world owes him is his name on the door. Thomas came and sat beside her on the barn floor, because there was no other place to sit, and because it was where she was. They sat there together in the quiet of the barn, the way they had sat through harder nights, shoulder to shoulder, and said nothing for a while, and that was all right. "Do you ever think about what would have happened?" Thomas said finally. "If you hadn't been at that auction? If we'd gone the day before, or the day after, or if the auctioneer had gotten to that lot an hour earlier?" Clara thought about it. She had thought about it before in the way you think about the narrow places in your life where things could have gone a different direction, and you know what the other direction would have looked like. "Someone else might have bought them," she said. "Maybe. Or they might have died there. Or they might have died there." Thomas was quiet. "I think about Whitmore," Clara said, "more than I think about the other way it might have gone. I think about a man who spent 30 years on something extraordinary and died and never knew if it had meant anything, never knew if any of it survived." She pressed her hand flat on the barn floor beside her on the clean, solid, real wood of the structure she and Thomas had built and nearly lost and kept. "And I think he did the work. He put it into the horses. He didn't know if anyone would ever look close enough to see it, but he did the work anyway because it was right. And because it was worth doing, and he trusted that the thing he built would outlast the circumstances that were trying to kill it." She looked at Thomas. "I just happened to be the person who looked." "Yijita. You weren't just the person who looked," Thomas said. "You were the person who fought for it. Looking was the beginning. The fighting was the rest of it." Clara smiled. "You fought too." "I hauled a lot of water barrels," he said. "That's not quite the same thing." "It is exactly the same thing." He put his arm around her and she leaned into his shoulder, and they sat there in the old barn until Elroy called from the house that supper was getting cold, and then they got up and went inside. Briggs was at the table already. He had been foreman for 3 years by then and had become in the way of people who find the right place late, so much a part of the ranch that Clara sometimes forgot there had been a time before him. He was a different man than the one who had leaned on her corral fence that morning with 11 years of Crowley's work on his conscience. Not softer. Briggs would never be soft, but cleaner somehow. A man who had gotten rid of something heavy and found that the weight he'd been carrying had been his own. He stood when Clara and Thomas came in the same way he always stood when Clara entered a room, not from formality, but from something older and more genuine than that. She had never asked him to do it. He had started doing it the first week and never stopped. "Governor's letter," Thomas said, settling into his chair. Briggs looked at Clara. "They're naming the new remount station Whitmore Station," she said. Something moved through Briggs's face. He sat back down slowly. "That's right," he said in the tone of a man confirming something that has always been true and is only now being properly acknowledged. "That's exactly right." Elroy raised his coffee cup across the table. Nobody had anything particular to toast, and they all knew it, and they all raised their cups anyway, because some moments ask for the gesture even when the words aren't there. "Samuel Whitmore," Elroy said. "Samuel Whitmore," they said together, and for a moment the room was very quiet and the fire burned in the grate, and outside in the dark pasture, Hope moved through the grass with her daughter beside her. The two of them, gray shapes in the night, unhurried together, carrying the whole living weight of 30 years of one man's careful work and 3 years of one woman's refusal to let it die. There was an afternoon the following spring that Clara would carry with her for the rest of her life. Hope had begun to slow in the genuine way of old horses that are winding down toward their last season. Not dramatic, not distressing, just the slow, dignified withdrawal of a creature that has done what it came to do and is beginning to be finished with the effort of doing it. She still came to Clara at the fence, still pricked her ears, still had the same dark, clear eye, but she tired more easily now, and she rested more in the afternoons, and Clara watched her with the particular watchfulness of a person who knows the time is getting short and wants to see everything there is still to see. One afternoon, Clara went out to the far pasture alone, and stood at the fence and called. And hope came to her in that slow, enormous-hearted walk, and Clara put her forehead against the gray neck the way she had done 100 times, and she stayed there a long while with her eyes closed. "You know what I was thinking about today?" she said softly. "That auctioneer. The look on his face when I said $2. Like I'd done something so foolish it was almost funny." She felt the mare's slow breath against her. And all those men laughing. Thomas standing there not knowing where to look, Crowley with his arms folded and that smile. She shook her head against the gray neck. "And you, standing in the middle of all of it with your head so low it nearly touched the ground, and not one single person in that whole yard thinking you were anything worth the trouble." She was quiet for a moment. "I want you to know something," she said. "I know you're a horse, and I know you can't understand the words, but I want to say it anyway because it's true, and it wants to be said out loud." She drew back just enough to look into that dark, steady eye. Everything good that happened from that day on the ranch, the contract graced the Whitmore station. The young woman who rode 2 days to sit on our porch and ask me how I knew all of it came from one thing. You were still standing. Her voice broke very slightly at the seam. You were half dead and terrified, and they had taken everything from you except the one thing they couldn't take, and you were still on your feet. That's all you did. You just refused to go down. She pressed her palm flat to the gray neck. I just refused to stop looking. Hope breathed against her shoulder. Warm. Steady. The same breath that had blown against her hand the night she'd eaten mash from Clara's palm in the dark barn. The same breath that had come in long, hard pulls at the finish line at Fort Dawson. The same breath, quieter now and slower, but still the same living, obstinate, extraordinary breath of a horse that had decided once to live and had never once reconsidered the decision. Clara stood there with her forehead against that gray neck until the sun had moved a considerable way across the sky, and when she finally straightened and wiped her face and walked back toward the house, she was smiling. Thomas was on the porch when she came back. He looked at her face and looked at the pasture and looked back at her face and said nothing, because he knew when there was nothing to say. Clara sat down in the chair beside him and looked out at the pasture where Hope stood in the late afternoon light, Grace beside her, both of them, still both of them quiet, the older one's gray muzzle resting gently on her daughter's neck, in the way of horses that have grown up knowing safety and have no reason to stand tense in the world. She's good, Clara said. She is, Thomas said. She's at peace. She is. Clara folded her hands in her lap. The ranch was quiet around them, the particular deep quiet of a working place at the end of a good day, horses in the pasture, smoke from the cookhouse, the sound of Briggs's voice, somewhere in the distance, giving an instruction to one of the hands in the unhurried, certain way he had found after 11 years of the other kind of certainty. The world Nathaniel Crowley had tried to prevent, the world that had come into being anyway, out of $2 silver and a refusal to look away. Clara Bennett lived to be 74 years old, and she worked every day of it that she was physically capable of working. And on the days she wasn't, she sat on the porch and watched the horses and told stories to whoever would listen, which was usually quite a few people, because the stories were worth hearing, and Clara Bennett told them the way she did everything else, without waste, without exaggeration, and with the complete attention of a person who understands that the truth, told plainly, is always more powerful than anything you could add to it. She outlived Thomas by 4 years, which was the one thing in her long life she would have changed if she could, and she never pretended otherwise. She outlived Elroy by 2 years, and Garrett by 7, and Briggs died the same winter she did, which she would have called appropriate, and she was right. She outlived Hope by 11 years, which was the debt that comes with loving animals, and she paid it the same way she paid every debt, fully, without complaint, and without pretending it didn't cost. She did not outlive what she had built. Nobody outlived what she had built. The Whitmore line was running in cavalry posts and freight operations and working ranches across the Western Territories long after Clara was gone, carrying her work forward the same way Whitmore's work had carried forward into her hands. The station outside Fort Dawson bore Samuel Whitmore's name on the gate, and under it on a smaller plate that someone had added quietly and without official sanction were two words that no one ever moved to remove: Bennett Ranch. And the story endured, the way true stories endure, not because anyone decided to preserve it, but because it preserved itself. Because it was the kind of story that people needed, that they kept finding. They needed again in the years and the decades after, when the world offered them something broken and exhausted and apparently finished, and they had to decide whether to look away or look closer. The story of a woman who had looked closer, who had seen what 32 horses still had in them when every man in the yard saw only what they had lost, who had been laughed at and burned out and threatened and squeezed to the edge of ruin, and had gotten up every single morning and done the work anyway, because the work was right and the horses were worth it, and she was not in the deepest part of herself capable of walking away from a thing that was still standing and still trying. The truest lesson of it was not the triumph. Plenty of stories have triumphs and are forgotten by the next season. The truest lesson was what came before the triumph. The ordinary, grinding, unglamorous daily decision to keep going. To haul the water one more time. To stay in the barn one more night. To hold on one more week when the arithmetic said stop. To look when the whole world was laughing and keep looking and not mistake the laughing for a verdict. And to understand this above everything, that the worth of a living thing cannot be measured on its worst day. That the forgotten and the discarded and the counted out carry something inside them that hard circumstances can diminish but cannot destroy. That the only thing required to bring it back is one person willing to see it before it's visible. One person willing to pay the price of the believing before the proof arrives. Clara Bennett had been that person. She had walked into an auction yard with $2 silver and walked out with the future of the American West tied to a rail behind her, and she had known it before anyone else did, and she had held on to it through everything. A frightened man and a hard summer could throw at a woman, and she had brought it through to the other side, sound and whole, and more than anyone had dared to hope for. She had spent her last $2 on 32 dying horses the whole world had given up on, and in doing so, she had built something that the whole world could not forget. That is the true and complete story of Clara Bennett and the Bennett Ranch and the horses of Black River Valley in the killing summer of 1881 and the long good years that followed after. And if it teaches anything at all, it teaches this one thing in the plainest words there are. The greatest things in this world are almost always found in the place everyone else already stopped looking, and all it ever takes to find them is one soul stubborn enough, humble enough, and brave enough to look.